Cool Figure TV. Revolutionary salute. Revolutionary salute. Like, share, subscribe. Welcome to the House of Revolution. You know, I'm your humble host, the Yao Mean of Revolution. Russia, China, and Iran are defeating the West, definitely, especially NATO and the U.S. too. Before we get into that, be sure to wipe your feet. That means hit the like button. You in the House of Revolution. Like, share, subscribe, support the platform, y'all. Well, World War III is still on the table. Trump is a maniac trying to attack Venezuela. The Zionists, they want to attack Iran, but Putin and China and Iran are too strong. Let's get into the content. Salute.
Donald Trump's meeting with Vladimir Putin in Alaska proved that, even despite the common desire to achieve peace in Ukraine, the tactical and strategic objectives of the United States and Russia are absolutely not the same. This is largely due to the fact that the Biden administration has so aggravated the geopolitical situation around Ukraine that Trump simply will not be able to fix everything physically and mentally in the next 4 years. In this regard, I am sure that the upcoming meeting between Putin and Trump in Budapest or Moscow will be fruitless again. Furthermore, in the international geopolitical arena, the United States continues to make more and more strategic mistakes. Experts believe that in 2026, the United States will lose the remnants of its authority and will say goodbye to the title of the hegemon. Russia has put the so-called partner in a difficult position. The United States is now
Revolutionary salute to our brother Lunch Break Chronicles for the donation to the war chest. Revolution is way of life. Absolutely appreciate the love, family. Salute.
Faced with a very difficult situation. The thing is that in 2022, after the United States has declared its support for Ukraine to the whole world, it will not be possible to abandon this country to its fate. Of course, the Americans really want to abandon Ukraine. But they can't. At the same time, the Americans are well aware that if they don't leave Ukraine, it will become even worse for the United States.
It will get worse.
After the shameful flight from Afghanistan in 2021, the United States needs, if not a small victory, then at least a small success. However, all the plans of the Americans were destroyed by Russia. Washington didn't expect that Moscow would take such a hardline position against Ukraine's possible membership in NATO, the deployment of Western armies on the territory of this Eastern European country, and recognition of the Zaporizhia, Kherson, Donetsk, and Lugansk regions, including Crimea, as part of the Russian Federation. Currently, Russia has issued an ultimatum to the United States, asking Washington to choose between two options, bad and very bad. Senior Russian politicians have repeatedly and unequivocally made it clear to the United States that there will never be
Putin. Everybody know Putin's on the phone with Trump the other day. Trump talking about giving Ukraine Tomahawk missiles, and Putin told him, well, look, you can pick which option do you want. You want bad or you want very bad.
NATO military facilities in Ukraine, and that Ukraine's voluntary abandonment of Donbass is Moscow's main condition for signing the long-awaited peace. And if the United States, along with Ukraine, does not agree to these conditions of Moscow, then Russia will achieve all its goals solely with the help of military force. In other words, Russia makes it clear that all foreign military installations on the territory of Ukraine will simply be physically destroyed. Furthermore, Moscow makes it clear that Russia is ready for any escalation and that, necessary, NATO facilities that are actively involved in the confrontation against Russia will be destroyed not only on the territory of Ukraine, but also in Eastern and Western European countries. It seems the United States has finally gotten that Putin wasn't bluffing. Actually, Putin never bluffed. It's not his methodology. If Europe decides to engage in military operations against Russia directly, Moscow will act according to the Georgian scenario of 2008. Russia does not need the territories of European countries and prisoners of war. Let everything remain in its place, both the territory and the troops. Russia will simply destroy everything that the Americans brought there. My friends, let me remind you that in 2008, after Georgian President Mikhail Saakashvili, on the orders of his masters in the West, attacked South Ossetia and destroyed the Russian military base there, Moscow decided to act very harshly towards the Georgian troops and the NATO military advisors supporting them. As a result, within 1 week, Russia managed to destroy the Georgian fleet and virtually all American heavy equipment. Simultaneously with this, Russian tanks approached the Georgian capital Tbilisi, after which the Georgian president was forced to sign a peace treaty on Moscow's terms. By the way, during this war, many American infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers were captured by Russian troops. After that, the Russian army left Georgia. It's also worth noting that, back then, the Americans demanded that Moscow return their infantry fighting vehicles and armored personnel carriers to them. However, in response, the General Staff of the Russian Federation harshly refused the Americans. Thus, returning to the current conflict in Ukraine, it becomes clear that if NATO decides to escalate, Europe will suffer the same fate as Georgia and Ukraine. Obviously, in the event of the outbreak of hostilities between Russia and NATO, the fighting will move to the territories of European states. The armies of NATO countries, especially from Poland and the Baltic countries, will hide in big cities, forcing the Russians to engage in street battles. However, given the fact that there are no Russian citizens in these European cities, Moscow will act very harshly, using the full range of weapons. Against this backdrop, it is worth recalling the words of the Russian general Andrei Mordvichev. In particular, he said that in the event of a full-scale war against NATO, the Russian army would not show mercy to the enemy, as it does towards Ukraine. Thus, the Russian general indirectly confirmed that in the event of a direct military clash between Russia and NATO, the world would see a completely different war, more brutal and bloody. Thus, the Kremlin makes it clear to the Trump administration that if the United States continues to talk to Moscow in the language of an ultimatum, and fails to convince the Kiev regime and the so-called European allies to accept Russia's conditions, the fighting may spread to the territory of NATO countries, where dozens of American bases are located. And now, President Trump faces a very unenviable choice. To watch in silence as Russia methodically destroys the Ukrainian army, along with Western weapons systems and American military instructors, and thereby completely lose face, or to agree to Russia's terms, and withdraw all military aid from Ukraine and declare the end of the era of cooperation and Western integration. And this again means the final loss of face. Simply put, Russia's victory in Ukraine and the withdrawal from this country of all military representatives of NATO countries, including the United States, will mean a second Afghanistan or Vietnam for Washington. Any of these scenarios is not just a loss of face. This is a disaster. In any of these options, the Senate will simply tear President Trump to pieces. He will certainly not be allowed to sit in the office for the entire presidential term, and the Republican Party will suffer a political collapse. Moreover, the United States may simply not survive a second Afghanistan or Vietnam. In the United States, the problems are already aggravated to the limit, and they simply won't survive another foreign policy defeat. Even because of Trump's simple desire to continue the negotiation process with Russia, the 47th President of the United States continues to be rebuked not only by Democrats, but even by some representatives of the Republican Party. Unfortunately, the White House and Congress are literally teeming with ardent Russophobes. In this regard, every attempt by Trump to establish contacts with Russia is perceived in the United States as a weakness and a concession to Putin. Thus, any result of such negotiations with Moscow literally kills Trump and his party. I believe that in such a situation, the current Trump administration has only one way out: to delay negotiations with Russia, preferably until the end of Donald Trump's presidential term. In addition, within 4 years, Trump must finally shift the Ukrainian issue onto the shoulders of Europe, completely shifting the focus to the trade war with China and further support for Taiwan. Only in this case, after the surrender of the Kiev regime, Donald Trump will be able to declare that it was Biden's war and not mine, and that it is Europe and the American Democrats who bear full responsibility for the defeat of Ukraine, which the Western globalists used as a battering ram against Russia. Well, my friends, will Trump be able to save the face of the United States against the backdrop of Russia's approaching victory in Ukraine? Well, we will receive the answer to this question very soon.
According to information received from the Russian Ministry of Defense, Russian reconnaissance personnel discovered transport and long-range UAV operators of the armed forces of Ukraine, who were soon approached by trucks loaded with equipment. The long-range drone launch and storage center is located near the settlement of Martov in Kharkiv region, approximately 35 kilometers, which is the closest point to the Russian border. From the launch pad, where Ukrainian operators were hastily trying to reassemble their launchers, they were preparing to launch the AN-196 Lyeti drone. However, it was too late. Double precision strikes by Russian Iskander-M tactical ballistic missiles on the evening of October 17, aimed at them after the unloading had begun, destroy the center completely. Iskander dealt an inevitable blow to Zelensky's elements, as in the footage from Objective Control. As a result, Kiev calculated the losses, as published by Russian media citing Russian military personnel, and confirmed by the Ministry of Defense. The strike destroyed 65 long-range Lyeti drones, which were intended to target Russian energy installations. In addition, 5 UAV launcher systems were destroyed, several support vehicles such as transport or trucks 4 units, and about 30 Ukrainian specialist troops were knocked out by the huge explosion of Iskander, and caused a big fire. Photos and videos leaked online show the nighttime aftermath of a devastating Jarin attack on targets in and around Kryvyi Rih, the Dnepropetrovsk region.
Fake news refuse to show us any war footage anymore. They barely talk about the war except for How many more weapons can we give Zelensky? That means how much of our money can they take and pretend like it's helping Ukraine? It's a money laundering scam, but they never show any of this type of humiliation that's going on.
Around a dozen explosions were heard on the evening of October 17th at 7:05 a.m. local time, the sky appearing bright as if the sun had risen. Witnesses reported that more than 20 Geran 2 drone strikes destroyed several targets in Kryvyi Rih, a Zelensky's hometown, receiving incoming calls from the Russian armed forces that night. Officially, several energy infrastructure facilities were damaged, plunging much of the city into darkness. The incident was beyond anyone's imagination. Russian drones struck the central mining and processing plant, depicting the night sky glowing red as flames engulfed the energy infrastructure, the military and industrial areas. Furthermore, the attack was carried out at dawn on the military infrastructure of the armed forces of Ukraine, the railway station, and the airport, where NATO-deployed aircraft were stationed. This was reported by Sergei Lebedev, coordinator of the pro-Russian Mykolaiv underground. Footage shows prolonged explosions at the airport. They counted about 15 explosions. It burned well, Lebedev said. Meanwhile, Ukrainian channels also reported severe damage to military installations and energy infrastructure. Fires were reported in several areas of the city. Local emergency response teams responded to reports of widespread damage. The latest Russian attack underscored Kiev's vulnerability and Zelensky's dwindling appeal to a war-weary West.
Douglas Macgregor, a defense and foreign policy analyst and former Pentagon advisor. Colonel Macgregor, thanks so much for taking the time to join me.
Sure.
Yeah, I want to get your take on the latest here as President Trump announced that he had a lengthy and productive phone conversation with Russian President Putin today, in which they agreed to a meeting of high-level advisors next week and to a follow-up meeting in person between the two of them in Budapest. Now, we know that Zelensky is set to meet with Trump at the White House on Friday, and Trump has been publicly saying, even threatening the approval of long-range Tomahawk cruise missiles for the war against Russia, but that's not something that he's mentioned since he's been talking about this conversation with Putin. So how do you view the current state of tensions?
Well, obviously, I have not read the text of the meeting, so at least I do not know what was actually discussed. What we know is that the last time there was a meeting in Anchorage, that President Trump and his team showed up and expected to overwhelm their Russian guests with charm and hospitality, but they came with without any proposals, and they weren't prepared to discuss the proposals the Russians had made. And so the Russians said very well, and they outlined once again their position, and there was no discussion because the Russians have made it very clear what they think and what they want. In other words, I think President Putin had hoped that we would read carefully and study carefully what they'd said so that we could come in and say, well, we studied 10 points. We're comfortable with the first 6. We're not comfortable with these 4. We'd like to talk about those and find out if there is any flexibility in those. But that didn't happen. Now, perhaps this time there's a willingness to do that. If there is, that would be good news. But thus far, President Trump seems to be most influenced by the last advisor he speaks to. And the last advisor he speaks to inevitably urges him to be tough and hard and quote unquote stand up to the Russians and reminds him that we are the most powerful nation in the world and ultimately they have to do what we want. Well, that's all nonsense, as you and I know. But unfortunately, that's where we've been in the past. So all we can do at this point is hope for the best. And the best would be a substantive discussion of what the Russians have proposed, because I think they would appreciate that. That demonstrates that we actually care what they think, that we respect their national strategic interests. We've never done that. We've acted as though they have no legitimate political interests whatsoever or national security interests in Ukraine, which is nonsense. So that's about as far as I'm willing to go. We'll have to wait and see.
Yeah, it's shocking, isn't it, when you look at the Trump administration's handling of this, given the fact that, I mean, we could be looking at the possibility of nuclear war or at the very least a sharp increase in tensions. And I do want to get into the Tomahawk conversation a little bit because I know that Zelensky is on his way to the White House. He's going to be pushing for it. And as Russian President Putin has been pointing out, he's like, look, if the US introduces Tomahawks into this war, it's not going to change the balance of power on the battlefield. The US apparently doesn't even have that many to send, but it will show Russia that the US military is directly involved in each attack on Russian soil because that is what is required. So why then do you think we've even had a conversation about Tomahawks being introduced into this conflict and that it has been front and center for the last few weeks now?
Somebody mentioned it to President Trump. President Trump really knows nothing about the Tomahawk missile. Perhaps he knows something now, and he suddenly realized that the Tomahawk is by no means a silver bullet. The Tomahawks come in three variants. One is air delivered or air launched. The other is sea launched. Those are not usable on the ground in Ukraine. In other words, the only way they could be launched would be if we provided bombers and air power to launch directly at the Russians. So the only real option is a ground launched missile system. Now, that system is very unique. It's very different from the other missiles insofar as the warhead is concerned. I can't go into great detail about it, but it's a 3,300-pound warhead, which it packs an enormous punch, but it has to be fired from the back of a truck. Now, there is a possibility that you could put the system into a 40-foot container. The container could be loaded onto a rail car or be on a barge in a river, I suppose. But in the final analysis, and this is what I think President Putin may have stated very categorically to President Trump, and hopefully he listened, the Russians are not stupid. We are going to have to conduct the mission planning and execution. In other words, you're going to have U.S. military personnel on the ground, presumably from the U.S. Army, or contractors from Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, or Americans not in uniform, temporarily, not on active duty. I mean, whatever you could do, but it has to be American. And the Russians will regard that as an act of war and respond accordingly. Now, I'm sure that President Trump did not say that in a state of rage or uncontrolled passion, because that's not his way of doing business. I think he just said very straightforwardly, we will treat this as an act of war. And there's always the outside possibility that you could mount a nuclear warhead on a Tomahawk. It would be a bad idea, but President Trump has not stated categorically that we will not initiate a nuclear strike. He should, and make that abundantly clear right up front. That would help enormously. And finally, as you point out, we estimate that we have between 20 and 50 missiles that we could fire. Presumably, these are the ground-launched variants, and that's not very much. And the probability is very high that Russian integrated air defenses would shoot most, maybe even all of them down. But the problem is, what do you do if one gets through? What do you do if it strikes a nuclear power station? What do you do if it falls on a civilian population? Even if you planned it to do other things, those things can happen, and the consequences for that kind of action are severe. So hopefully President Trump now understands that clearly and has been willing to reconsider. But again, I don't know who he's going to send, who's going to speak for the administration. I haven't seen much evidence for anybody in this White House. I wasn't very impressed with the last bunch, but I don't know that we have anybody in this administration who is really qualified to talk in detail about these kinds of things. So we'll have to see. At least it's encouraging insofar as it postpones another stupid decision with stupid consequences.
Yeah, as you're describing it there, I'm going, of course, Russia would see that as an act of war, right? Of course, Russia is watching the US continue to escalate. And I know that, Putin typically has a very measured approach of kind of letting him know, hey, we're pointing it out to you that we see exactly what you're doing. But as you're also describing there, I believe in the statement from Trump, he mentioned Secretary of State Marco Rubio is leading the delegation of high-level advisors that's set to happen next week. I don't look at Marco Rubio and have confidence that we're ever going to see a reduction in war. I look at him as a hothead who's going to take us to more and more war. Given that, and given the fact that you have Zelensky coming to the White House tomorrow, what are your concerns for the ways in which the Trump administration could still latch on to escalating this, even as we do have these talks with Russia coming up?
Well, we have never recognized Russia's legitimate national security interests in Ukraine. We've treated the Russians as though they have no right to defend themselves. We've pretended that what's happened in Ukraine is an accident of history, which is of no interest to us. We have never accepted responsibility for this regime and the terrible things that it's done, not only to the Russians, but its own people. And we have never stated categorically that, yes, we've had a hand in planning and executing most of the failed ground operations in Ukraine, which has cost the Ukrainians 1.7 to 1.8 million dead in Ukrainian uniform. So I don't know what we can expect. Senator Rubio is an intelligent man. He's not stupid, but he is an acolyte of Bill Kristol's. And Bill Kristol is a very prominent neocon and probably globalist. It's the same school of thought, essentially. So I don't know what we can expect. Again, as I said earlier, I don't know who else is going to be part of the delegation, but if we're going to go in there and make demands and reject the idea that what happens in Ukraine is existential to Russia and not to us, I don't know how far we're going to get.
Yeah, when you have the US acting as though, the government in Kiev just kind of fell apart in 2014. We don't know what happened, when they know exactly what happened. And that brings me to the next conflict that I want to bring up here, because I know that Trump also confirmed on Wednesday that he has authorized the CIA to conduct covert action in Venezuela, and said he's considering strikes on Venezuelan territory. Are we headed for, I know he's talking about all of this peace right now, but it sounds like we're headed for another war here. Is that how you see it?
Yes. No one is asking hard questions about the real purpose of American military action against Venezuela, or the potential strategic impact on the United States, good or bad. Most people in the Senate seem to privately think, well, Venezuela could be an opportunity for Washington to recover trillions in wealth squandered on failed U.S. military interventions in the Middle East and Ukraine. In fact, when I listen to people talk about Venezuela, they sound as though they're ready to climb into their Viking boats, sail down to Venezuela, steal everything that they need and want, without regard to what happens to the population. Because all they talk about is Venezuela's oil and gas, its gold mines, its emerald mines. There isn't much discussion, frankly, on the Hill or inside the Beltway about the alleged role that Venezuela plays in drug and human trafficking, because, frankly, it's very small. Colombia is much more heavily involved, as is Mexico. So the notion that we're going there is going to have some sort of impact on drug trafficking that will benefit us is very much open to debate. I guess the bottom line is, if you go back, you'll find out that Paul Wolfowitz, in testifying to Congress, said that Iraq's.
But Trump just told the Colombian president today that he's a drug trafficker. He better fight drug dealers, or else he gonna get it too. But the reason he attacked the Colombian president, which he already banned him from entry into the U.S. and banned his visa, took his visa, is because he was going after the genocide in Gaza. And he's telling the truth about U.S. imperialism in the Caribbean, in Latin America. And Colombia is the #1 spot for drug traffickers. You have 5 U.S. military bases there. The U.S. is pushing this dope. But so Trump definitely talking to the Colombian president, called him a dope dealer today and said that he better deal with drugs or else. But it's just showing the world what type of hypocrite Trump really is.
Oil would ultimately pay for the war and the occupation of Iraq. None of that happened. It was a complete failure. And we went into the hole to the tune of trillions of dollars. So I think anybody who asserts that we can arbitrarily enter that country or bully that country with the goal of taking their resources and getting away with it is very wrong. I also worry about the ramifications in Latin America. We're not exactly popular in Latin America. We can go through that history. I don't think going into Venezuela will help us. In fact, I think it could become a cause around which much of Latin America rallies. We end up dealing with hundreds of thousands of paramilitaries from various parts of South America, including Brazil and Colombia, that'll pour in there to help fight us. And I'm not talking about weapons designed to sink ships at sea. I'm talking about letting us come into the country and then killing us in great numbers the longer we stay there. I don't know, but I don't see any evidence for clear thinking. I don't see any evidence for debate. I do see a lot of evidence that the CIA is very, very excited about this and strongly supports it.
Yeah, the CIA is like, finally, we get to do something. Well, I say new as if they haven't been targeting Venezuela for a number of years now, but they at least get a new version of the operation. And as you're describing it there, I'm also reminded of a recent Politico article in which they quoted their anonymous officials who said that the Trump administration was very intentionally using these allegations of drug trafficking to paint Nicolas Maduro as a terrorist, as the head of a drug cartel, in the hopes that it would get the MAGA movement on board, that they would pass right through the no more wars, I'm going to end the wars, and go towards, oh, well, drug trafficking, concerns about our border here in the US, and hop on board with it. How do you see that potential strategy and really what it means for the American people who have said, look, we don't want more endless wars? And it sounds like that's another one that the US could be getting directly involved in.
Oh, I don't think there's any question about that. Let's go back and reflect on some things. In the mid 90s, late 90s, we became enamored with this notion of regime change. We directed it initially in Bosnia-Herzegovina at the Serbs. Subsequently, we resumed this process in Kosovo. All of it was designed to remove Milosevic. As you'll recall, he was the cause celeb at that point. And we thought that we would end up running Yugoslavia the way we ran the Philippines, with some governor general sitting in Manila. Only this time he would sit in Belgrade. None of that worked. It cost us a lot of money. And even though we had very smart people in the Clinton administration who opposed this, one of whom was Secretary of Defense Perry, who said, let us not get involved in anything which requires us to maintain a permanent ground military presence. That's exactly what happened. And we have been caught up in this web of deceit and stupidity in the Balkans ever since. And you move on beyond that. It wasn't enough to go into Afghanistan and remove or kill Osama bin Laden and his crew. No. We had to go in there and take over the country. We had to remove everyone who was in power. And then the country would improve and get better and ultimately become a feather in our caps. And we all know how that ended. Simultaneously, we go to Iraq, and again, we have to remove the regime. It wasn't enough to say, give us, Saddam Hussein's head. And you 3 or 4 generals, you're now in charge of the country, and you'll coordinate with the United Nations for elections, and we'll help you as we can. But no. We had to dismantle the government, dismantle the army, dismantle the administration. We all know how that worked out. And we wanted the same thing under Biden when it came to Russia. It was not enough to find a solution that would end this terrible war. No, on the contrary, we wanted the war because the war was supposed to remove President Putin from power. And in fact, that wasn't enough. We wanted to effectively rape Russia, steal its resources, divide it, balkanize it. That hasn't worked. So we then turned our attention to supporting Israel in its bid to destroy Iran. But the real point in Iran was, once again, regime change and then balkanization. Turn Iran into some imitation of Syria or, destroyed Lebanon. And now we're talking about Venezuela. Why do we want to remove the regime? Because the regime is a heinous criminal that is killing millions of Americans? No, that's nothing to do with it. Seems to be all about resources. And that's why I said go back and remember that in March of 2003, Paul Wolfowitz, who was then Deputy Secretary of Defense, assured Congress that Iraq, through its oil revenue, would pay for everything, pay for reconstruction, pay for our occupation, pay for the war. I think we're headed down the same road. And the only solution, I think, is for the American people to throw everybody out of office who sits in Washington, because I don't know what else you can do.
Yeah, at this point, I don't know that there's any fixing them or any solving this problem with the current people that are there, because they've learned how to play the game. And clearly, as you're noting there, they have a blueprint that they use time and time again. Now, while I have you here, I do want to get into Iran a little bit, because I know we have ongoing concerns that the US and Israel are preparing for the next phase of war against Iran, especially as there's now a ceasefire in Gaza, as you have Trump declaring the war against Hamas over, at least for the moment. What are your concerns about the US engaging in further war against Iran? And is that something we could see as early as Christmas of this year?
Well, first, let me touch briefly on the ceasefire. I don't think the ceasefire is even turning out to be a pause. That was about the most that you could expect from it. The notion that we're going to now enrich the Trump family, Mr. Kushner, Witkoff, or anybody else involved in the reconstruction of Gaza, which really amounts to turning it into some sort of Las Vegas-like destination. I think the probability of those things ever happening is very low. But I do think people have actually maintained those fantasies. But I don't think this ceasefire is going to last. And we already had, within the first 24 hours, 7 Palestinians killed. The Israelis were trying to withhold aid, and only under great pressure have they allowed 600 trucks to move aid and sustenance into Gaza. I don't think this war in Gaza is over. And as I said, we might see a pause, but that's about the most that you can expect. In the meantime, President Trump has stated, I think just within the last couple of hours, that if the people of Gaza won't respect this ceasefire, and I don't know why he said that, but he did, then he says, I guess we'll have to kill them all, which of course is very Stalin-like. Stalin believed in prophylactic justice. Kill the citizen before the citizen gets a chance to commit a crime. That's what it sounds like he wants to do in Gaza, which may be music to Mr. Netanyahu's ears, but I think is reprehensible from the standpoint of an American citizen. I can't imagine why anybody would want that. Now, having said all that, let's now touch on Iran. The preparations for war with Iran continue, both on the U.S. and the Israeli side. We are positioning assets at sea, air assets in close proximity, concentrating tankers, all the kinds of things that we've seen in the past. So I think there is a very definite readiness for war. Now, what's the pretext for war with Iran? I don't know. Is it going to be a false flag? I mean, we certainly saw that twice in Syria that precipitated cruise missile launches into the desert sands there back when President Trump was in office the first time. Rachel, I don't know, but I think it's going to happen. I'm a little surprised it hasn't happened already, but maybe we had a pause here so that President Trump could burnish his credentials for a future Nobel Peace Prize. I don't know. But I don't think we're going to get to Christmas without this war. Now, there are other opinions. Alistair Crook has suggested, given the weather, that Israeli air power might not be as effective over the winter, and therefore they may wait longer. I don't know, because Mr. Netanyahu's in a difficult position. His popularity in Israel is one thing, but Israel's position with the American people has certainly deteriorated. I don't think a complete break with Israel is by any means in the offing, but he's got to sit back and begin to ask the question of how long can I get away with this unconditional support from the United States? How many people can I ultimately control through whatever means, money and otherwise, on the Hill? I don't know the answers to those questions, but I'm sure he's asking those. So, yeah, I think it has to happen before Christmas. But, I could be wrong and they could wait longer.
Yeah, it's interesting to kind of see that back and forth there. And I'm with you. It feels like they're preparing for something sooner rather than later. The last thing I want to get into is just kind of the state of the American people, because as we've been talking about through this conversation, I mean, you've got Iran, Venezuela, still an ongoing proxy war against Russia, still neocons who want war with China, and so on and so forth. And then adding Gaza back in. And the American people, they're looking around and going, okay, it's almost been a year since the majority of them voted for the guy who told them no new wars, right? I'm going to stop the wars. And even now, Trump is kind of playing this charade of, oh, I've got, 6 or 7 peace deals. He's apparently solving conflicts that we didn't know existed. And he's still trying to keep that as the public front. I don't know if that all goes away just because he didn't get the Nobel Peace Prize, but how do you view the state of the American people and kind of their awareness about what their government is continuing to do, no matter who they vote into office?
I think the American people are aware of rising inflation. I think they're aware that the economy is fragile, though they may not understand the particulars or the details. They're looking at their way of life. They're looking at the criminality. Contrary to popular belief, I think lots of Americans who live close to large cities that have experienced criminality are welcoming many of the things that President Trump wants to do. But even those things don't come across as well planned, well orchestrated. I haven't seen President Trump take to the airways and try to build support for the policies he wants to follow. I think he likes rallies. He likes to go to rallies and interact with people that cheer him, make flippant remarks, exaggerate things, get into the plane and go home. I mean, that's kind of what he does. What he really needs to do now is the kind of thing that, frankly, FDR did in the late 30s, which is explain, why are we doing what we are doing? Why are we going to help the British? Why are we taking the actions we are against Japan? All this sort of business. It never happened. It never happens now. It needs to. So that's problem number one. But there's something else here that we can't lose sight of, Rachel. And you're down there in San Antonio. You know this better than I do. Most Americans do not pay much attention to what happens beyond their borders. And most Americans think that war is something that happens on somebody else's soil. The possibility that they could be drawn into something and that they could suffer, their families could suffer, their cities, their towns could suffer, I don't think they believe that. So it worries me a great deal, because we could end up in this seemingly minor intervention in Venezuela that turns into a giant quagmire. But that's the kind of quagmire that could visit us here at home. And that quagmire could ultimately find common ground with other problems overseas. I mean, if you're Chinese and you're Russian and you're sick of the way that we have been treating them, and in fact, just before we started, I received a note from someone that said that President Trump has announced to everyone that India has agreed not to buy any more oil from Russia. But then the spokesman for the Indian government said, that's nonsense. We're going to buy oil and gas from Russia. We don't know what he's talking about. I don't know what's going on in the White House. I often think they're disconnected from strategic reality. No one's asking any hard questions. What are we doing? Why are we doing it? What's the purpose? How do we plan to proceed? What's it going to look like when we're through? What's the strategic impact on us? Not next week, not before Christmas, long term. Everything is short fused. President Trump loves optics. That's what you saw in front of the Knesset. He just said, we got a great ceasefire, or everything's coming up roses. We're going to have peace. Everything's going to be wonderful. Then he turns around a day later and says, well, if the Gaza residents aren't going to go along with this, well, then I guess we'll just have to kill them all. Thank you, Joseph Stalin. That's not something I would have expected to hear from an American president or anybody in the Western world. So I don't have a good answer.
Yeah, it's very telling. And I think a good reminder to kind of keep in mind as we're watching Trump that this is the way he tends to do things. He'll go from one extreme to the next. And so, even bringing it back to where we started, looking at the upcoming talks with officials from Russia, an upcoming meeting with Putin, while yes, that looks like it could be a step in the right direction, you also never know. And I think it goes back to what you were saying about these officials living in a bubble here in the US. It's not going to do them well long term. There is certainly a lot at stake here all around. And I really appreciate you taking the time to join me today to break down all of the latest here. Retired US Army Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a defense and foreign policy analyst and former Pentagon advisor. Thank you so much.
What assurances are there that the Israelis will comply? They never comply.
Yeah.
They've already
None.
killed 7 people, and they've blocked food from coming in.
Yeah. No, none. When Trump signed that deal, I described it as it's like holding a wedding, except the bride and groom weren't there. And in this case, you didn't have either the Zionist government of Netanyahu or the Palestinians represented at the actual signing ceremony. So, the reality remains Hamas is not going to surrender its weapons. It's not going to agree to let some outside international force come in and rule over them. They're not going to surrender their own sovereignty. And Israel is not giving up on its quest from the river to the sea, to take Judea and Samaria, as they call it, and expel the Palestinians. So this is a mythological creature. It's like a unicorn.
Scotty, you agree, I'm going to guess.
Yeah, I mean, in theory, there's a plan waiting to be discovered. But as Larry said, the people that gathered together and signed a document were the people who were supposed to guarantee this, who said, we're gonna make this happen. But the people that need to make it happen, Hamas and Israel, weren't represented, and they're talking cross purposes. They're not on the same sheet of music. And the United States and its European allies haven't shown any ability at all to get Israel to, make compromises necessary. This deal will not happen if Hamas has to 100% disarm. If Hamas is allowed to retain a police force, there could be a partial disarmament, even one that you could say the majority of their weapons have been removed. But the idea that Hamas is going to surrender its weapons at a time when Israel is arming, equipping, and aiding anti-Hamas militia groups among the Palestinian community in Gaza to go down and hunt down Hamas is ludicrous. Hamas will never do that. And 2, Hamas will never give up its right to be politically represented. The president, when he announced that this peace treaty was done, his original 20 points, had Hamas disarming and had Hamas walking away. But Hamas, when they said we're going to agree to this, they put down 2 conditions. And one was, sort of an asterisk on disarmament, meaning we're willing to do it, but it's conditional. And 2, no, we're going to be part of this government that you're forming. And Trump went, okay. And if you remember early on when Hamas was executing collaborators in the street, Trump said, no, this is good. I approve of this. This is a police force. They're there. But now Trump is backing away, saying that if Hamas continues to kill people and doesn't totally disarm, there will be, hell to pay. And Israel is already in violation of the ceasefire agreement, shelling North Gaza. I think this agreement is in danger of collapsing before it ever really got off the ground.
Here's one of the far right members of Prime Minister Netanyahu's cabinet, the infamous Bezalel Smotrich, saying, guess what? We're going to install settlements in Gaza? Chris, number 7.
There will be Jewish settlement in Gaza. Without settlement, there is nothing. First of all, the territories of the land of Israel are ours, but without settlement, they have no foothold. So we have patience, but we also have determination and faith.
Yeah.
So there you have it right there, Larry. They don't have settlements in Gaza now. And yet, after this so-called ceasefire, which is a step toward a possible Palestinian state, they think they're going to further peace by installing settlements?
Yeah. Look, the only way this Gaza peace deal would actually work is if Donald Trump would tell Bibi Netanyahu and the settlers, no, this is not going to happen. If you dare to do that, we're going to cut off all aid. Well, he's not going to do that. He made it very clear the other day when he was praising Miriam Adelson for the billions of dollars. You know, she's loyal first and foremost to Israel, not the United States. And this is the problem Trump faces. His constituency is largely America first, not second. Instead, Israel first under Trump, and it's just not going to hold. So this, I wrote last week the history of these previous ceasefires, and since 2017, they last less than a year. So it's just it's a matter of time. This is not going to result in a historic peace as Donald Trump proclaimed.
Scotty, while we were in Moscow yesterday, here's what the president said about disarming Hamas. Chris, cut number 6.
On Gaza, how long will it take Hamas to disarm, and can you guarantee that is going to happen?
Well, they're going to disarm, and because they said they were going to disarm. And if they don't disarm, we will disarm them.
How will you do that?
I don't have to explain that to you. But if they don't disarm, we will disarm them. They know I'm not playing games. Okay. Now, we did something monumental. We got the hostages back. That was the first thing we had to do. Above all else, get the hostages back. Now, they misrepresented because we were told they had 26, 24 of dead hostages, if we can use those terms. And it seems as though they don't have that because.
So, Scotty, how would the United States government go about disarming Hamas without putting boots on the ground?
And we're not going to put boots on the ground. We would just greenlight Israel. Look, the president basically said that he defeated Hamas by providing Israel with perfect weaponry, some that he doesn't even know about, but he gave it to them, sold it to them. I believe that we would continue just to greenlight Israel going in and doing what they've been doing. It's a failed policy. It hasn't succeeded. It won't succeed, and the president will be left with egg on his face. But this is a man who only knows how to bluster, only knows how to talk tough. The problem with talking tough is sometimes people call your bluff, and the president is at risk of having his bluff called here and not being able to back his words up, because the United States isn't putting boots on the ground. We may facilitate Israeli airstrikes, but this is stupid because what can a U.S. Navy F/A-18 do that an Israeli F-35 can't? We're just talking about dropping bombs. So having American planes flown by American pilots dropping American bombs on Gaza isn't going to change, qualitatively what happens when American planes flown by Israeli pilots dropping American bombs on Gaza takes place.
Larry, let's jump to an area of the world in which you spent a lot of time with the Central Intelligence Agency and the State Department, and that is Latin America. Can I ask you a very basic question? What national security threat to the United States of America is posed by the government of Venezuela?
As they say in Spanish, nada, cero, nothing, zero. This is a contrivance. And frankly, it's been in the CIA plan since Donald Trump ordered it in 2018. That's when they created Tren de Aragua as a group. I mean, it may have existed at that time, but the CIA went to work to promote it as this major threat. It is not the primary, it's not even a secondary or tertiary source of narcotics coming into the United States. the only thing that's really come into the United States out of Venezuela have been a number of Venezuelans who have fled the country. But the fact is, Maduro does not represent a threat. But this is an unprovoked action by the United States. Trump continues to build up military forces. There are 2, I think, Marine expeditionary units offshore. There are 4 battleships with missiles on board. But Venezuela is trying to avoid a confrontation. But Trump is headed towards a confrontation, and it'll be, when it happens, it'll be a war crime.
Scotty, where is the great national debate? Where is the debate on the floor of the Congress about the pros and cons of war? Why are we going to fall into the same trap of a presidentially declared, presidentially waged war? He'll claim some sort of presidential victory. What happens when boys come home in body bags?
Well, I mean, if we have Americans coming home in body bags in significant numbers, of course, that should precipitate a problem. But the Trump administration has articulated a case for conflict that, while legally questionable, passes muster with his base. Believe it or not, his base wants this war. They're told that Venezuela is ruled by this evil man who's already been indicted by the Southern District of New York as a narco trafficker. And we need to bring this man to justice, is what they're being told. When you have a de facto case like this that's been prepared, where's the debate? I mean, it's not debatable in the United States whether Maduro is not just indicted, but a convicted. No, I think you're right. He's indicted, not convicted yet,
Right.
but an indicted narco trafficker that has fled justice, is evading justice. This is how Marco Rubio describes it. And legally, he's correct. And so now the question is, do you bring him to justice? And the way that Trump has articulated the case for war, it revolves around the very same fentanyl smuggling, narrative that he used to promote border security. So all these people are jumping up and down saying, "Oh my goodness, border security is the best it's ever been." We got Kash Patel now bragging about how he's rounded up fentanyl this summer, and everybody being told we're doing our job to seal the border. But now we got Venezuela, which is shipping fentanyl in, and nobody's asking the question, is this true? What's your evidence, etc. They're just saying, this is what we voted for. Shut it down. And unfortunately, that's why there's no debate, discussion, and dialogue, because the base doesn't want one, and the Trump administration therefore doesn't feel compelled to give them one.
And so we have a constitution of no authority, Larry.
Yeah. Well, and here Trump is murdering people on the allegation that they're carrying drugs on these boats, and you can prove very easily that those boats had no means to reach the United States. I mean, the very first one they blew up had a range of 250, 260 miles with, the 4 outboard motors on board that cigarette boat. Now, that means it could go about 260 miles. But the problem is, from the coast of Venezuela, the north coast, to, say, the Florida Keys, which is the point farthest south in the United States, that's over 1,300 miles. How in the hell does a boat that can only go 250 miles going to be transporting drugs into the United States? And yet Donald Trump ordered, and it doesn't bother me so much that Trump ordered it. What really bothers me is the military chain of command that carried out this order. It was an illegal order. They didn't push back because nobody in that boat was firing at the United States. There was no way you could make a case that it posed a direct threat to the United States. And yet the generals and colonels up and down the chain of command, and admirals, let's not forget them, went along with this.
But Scotty,
shame on them.
Scotty, does it mean anything that the admiral in charge of the Southern Command, which is a 3-year gig, resigned yesterday after just 1 year? Is there a connection, do we know, between his resignation and these illegal murderous strikes?
If there is, it hasn't been publicly articulated yet, and nor will it be, because I think resigning is one thing. Resigning by making noise could cost you a star or a stripe in this case, and pension money. But I would imagine that according to the news, the president signed a presidential finding authorizing the CIA to carry out covert lethal action, which means that in this theater of operations, the CIA now has primacy. And I think that is something that could prompt a commander of Southern Command to step aside, being compelled to sit back and support a constitutionally questionable action. Presidential finding just makes it legal. Temporarily, it doesn't make it constitutional.
Correct,
at all.
correct. But Larry, in all your years of observing and receiving presidential findings of covert action, have you ever heard the President of the United States announce publicly that he authorized covert action?
Now it's like, I don't think he knows the definition of covert. It's not supposed to be known. It's supposed to be secret. They're not supposed to. You're not supposed to have the hand of the CIA deliberately exposed like that. And so I was not aware that the head of U.S. Southcom resigned or was forced out. Hopefully, it was a resignation in protest to say, look, I'm not going to carry out illegal orders. If that is in fact the case, and kudos on him for doing so. At least there was one person in that chain of command that had the integrity to stand up. Look, I've got a personal stake in trying to stop the fentanyl from coming into the country. I had a 39-year-old nephew that died in my house of a fentanyl overdose. I don't at all dismiss. I know the pain and anguish the families are going through, but that wrong does not justify murdering people just on suspicion that they're carrying drugs. And what shocks me is that so many Americans go along with this. Say, yeah, this is okay. I mean, it was normalized under Barack Obama when he killed Anwar al-Awlaki and Awlaki's son, both American citizens who had allegedly terrorists. They had not been convicted in a court of law. In the United States, we still have under the Constitution the presumption of innocence.
Right. Scotty, let's go to the topic of the moment, which occurred during our time here in Moscow, and that is the phone call between President Trump and President Putin yesterday. What do you think they said to each other? What do you think President Putin demanded of President Trump? Is there a marker? Is there a condition laid down by President Putin for him to come to Budapest and meet Donald Trump in a week or so?
I believe there is. I believe that this conversation was, to quote Mr. Ushakov, the president's advisor, very frank. They had a frank exchange, which means they didn't agree. And I believe that President Trump was put on notice that Russia is not going to change what it's doing on the battlefield, that the Tomahawk missile, if incorporated into Ukraine's arsenal, will not have any impact on the battlefield, won't move the needle at all. But what it will do is destroy any possibility of U.S.-Russian relations and could lead to further escalation. So nothing good will come of this. And then the president, and then they put forward some other things. I believe they talked about, Kirill Dmitriev type economic pie in the sky stuff. And Putin offered to meet, which, Trump wants because he wants to be seen as facilitating this. But the condition is that Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, and Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State, have to meet first. And I believe from that, the United States has to say they will not be deploying the Tomahawk missile, because I think the meeting between Trump and Putin can't happen if Trump is holding the Tomahawk over Putin's head. Putin wouldn't meet under those conditions at all. He's not going to allow himself to have the appearances of being intimidated. Right. So the United States is going to have to back away from Tomahawk. And, if you take a look at Zelensky, who fully expected to be greeted with a color guard and a red carpet and President Trump, shaking his hand coming down the plane, he's greeted by nobody. And he's walking into a completely different environment. So I have a funny feeling that the president's going to give him the bad news today, which is there won't be Tomahawks coming. And and that the president's going to put a hold on everything until after his meeting with Putin.
Larry, before you respond, here is President Trump yesterday, after the conversation with President Putin, joking about tomahawks. Cut number 5.
Tomahawks in Ukraine? We'll be talking about Ukraine, yeah. I mean, I have the president coming in on Friday, and I know what he has to say. He wants weapons. He would like to have tomahawks. Everyone else wants tomahawks. And we have a lot of tomahawks. Tomahawk is do you need any tomahawks in Argentina?
You can cross Moscow tomahawks.
You need them for your opposition, I guess, because see, in this country, they'd use tomahawks for the opposition. I don't do that. I'm much nicer. The Democrats would use them if they had the chance. They're sick people. Go ahead.
He was sitting across the table from President Milei of Argentina, and it was to him that he was joking, do you want tomahawks? Isn't this deadly, deathly serious business, Larry Johnson?
He doesn't seem to understand it. Maybe he's confused that he thinks the tomahawks are like it looks like a hammer with a sharp edge, what the American Indians, some of the Native American Indians carried. But, this is a weapon capable of killing people. I think it packs about a 500-pound warhead. And it is capable, though not current in its current configuration, it cannot carry a nuclear warhead, but it is capable of being configured to do so. And so if you're a Russian military planner, you just have to assume that if the United States is going to deploy it, they have to be ready for that. But it's so cavalier. And, we've seen this steady parade of Wunderwaffen, the wonder weapons that have come down, starting, with HIMARS and ATACMS and F-16s. None of it's the war is going to end and Ukraine is going to lose. That's the reality.
I'm going to let you guys go. I know you both have commitments coming up in a few minutes.
People better buckle up because what's coming in the next 12 days could change everything. November 1st, that's when the world hits a big bang moment, a reset that will reshape the global order for decades to come. We're talking about the dollar losing dominance, gold stepping up as the world's backbone, and the defining question of our time. Can China's Communist Party and Trump's America First movement find some kind of common ground at all? Or are we heading towards an open kinetic conflict with China? War. It all comes down to the Trump-Xi Jinping summit on November 1st, 12 days from now. And the stakes literally couldn't be higher. Over these next 12 days, here on our channel, we're going to break down how both sides are shaping the global narrative and what it means for you, because what's happening will ripple through every investment market, every economy, every household, and it's going to affect all of us.
I have a very good relationship with President Xi, and we're going to see what happens. But for years, we were taken advantage of by China very badly. We were losing hundreds of billions of dollars a year to China. We really built their military, if you think about it. The kind of money that presidents allowed to be lost to China was just insane.
I always try to focus on preparation and education, trying to help you spot the opportunities that come out of global chaos. I'm a glass half full kind of guy. And 2025 has already shown us how massive these opportunities can be. We've seen together how gold and silver, as well as mining stocks, have surged, skyrocketed in 2025. And today I'm going to show you now what I consider to be my number one no holds barred new idea for the coming decade, because it follows all of the riots, unrest, security threats, and tragedies that we've witnessed as both our country and many other countries are going through revolutions right now. I'm really calling this shift the Great Reserve realignment from dollar debt right now to hard metals, because the coming Trump-Xi Jinping standoff is the pinnacle of a half century of U.S. dollar supremacy, which is now collapsing. I mean, it is the world's reserve currency, but for how much longer? We are entering an era that none of us have ever lived through before. None of us. For 50 years, the dollar treasury complex was the backbone of global finance. That system is now breaking apart in real time. Central banks around the world are pulling back from US debt, flooding into physical gold. And it's not a passing trend, it's policy. We've seen gold's incredible ascent, just as I predicted, and we've detailed here on the channel. We're seeing foreign central banks stopping the recycling of US trade surpluses into US bills and bonds and ceasing this lubrication of globalization. It's grinding to a halt, and they're stopping to subsidize American deficits. They're done. This is a monumental shift, guys. And you can see it in two data streams that I've been studying over the past few weeks. Number one, a multi-year downdrift in foreign official appetite for U.S. government paper. They don't want U.S. treasuries. It's all being led by China. And number two, an unprecedented sort of persistent bid for physical gold by central banks. I know it seemed like cute at first. Oh, all these central banks are buying gold. Yeah, that's just a fun thing. Now gold's over $4,300 an ounce. They're dumping U.S. treasuries, and all of these central banks around the world are buying up as much gold as they can. This isn't cute anymore. Why are these two things happening? Well, because three big shocks changed everything that I want to go over right now. Number one, the weaponization of reserves. When the West suddenly froze Russia's assets in 2022, it sent shockwaves. It made sanction risk very real. In multiple countries, not just Russia, Biden and the EU's sanctions really screwed over all of us. Never before had we seen something like this. We're going to steal your money? Okay, and then we're going to give it to Ukraine? Number two, you have debt math right now. The math is stunning. China's U.S. Treasury holdings are now at their lowest since 2009. They're hoarding gold instead and dumping U.S. Treasuries. And number three, a fractured trade system. Beijing is pushing for a gold-anchored yuan system to reduce dollar friction and build its own reserve network around the world. Beijing anticipated this environment, and they are pushing yuan usage and gold-linked plumbing to sort of cushion this dollar friction and transition in their country.
So let's begin with how much gold you think China actually has.
Yeah, China has been understating its gold reserves by possibly a factor of 10. And I believe this is the biggest story in world finance. I've been arguing that this is a huge, huge story for many years. I've been tracking it along with a couple of other gold analysts out there. And the West is just asleep at the wheel, or they're ignoring it, or it's just one of these stories. It's so huge that it's easier just to leave it to somebody else further down the road.
The dollar treasury system isn't over yet, because people will be like, oh, the dollar's not dead yet. Yet, exactly, yet is the correct word. But the mix is changing right in front of our eyes in real time. Listen to this data that I've been going over. It's stunning. Central banks bought over 1,000 tons of gold in 2024, the third year in a row. China's central bank has now been buying for 11 straight months. Poland, their gold reserves just passed the European Central Bank's own holdings. In June, the Shanghai Gold Exchange opened its first offshore certified gold bullion vault in Hong Kong and then launched new yuan-denominated gold contracts. This isn't just optics, it's reserve plumbing that now allows non-dollar physical settlement and storage. And Beijing is inviting friendly central banks to just go and buy and store gold bullion, pulling foreign official reserves into China's orbit. So now those reserves sit in China. And many nations are now repatriating their gold bullion, bringing it home, getting it away from foreign countries. The idea of the multipolar order is here and protecting themselves against future sanctions. I mean, Russia learned its lesson. So it's about building a parallel rail right now that becomes harder to sanction, more attractive as tariffs and geopolitical frictions suddenly multiply. And in such a world, central banks do not have to choose one system. They can hedge with gold and they can transact through multiple pipes, multipolarity. This isn't a theory. This is a total global pivot towards a multipolar, gold-anchored world. None of us have lived through this, guys. This is away from US dollars. You know, maybe grandpa sitting there on a rocking chair who's 95 years old could talk about a time when we saw something similar. But none of you watching right now have lived through this. None of us. This is all away from US dollars. And it's all converging on November 1st. The Trump-Xi Jinping showdown. It's like Gary Cooper and High Noon kind of stuff. It's about to get very real. Trump's America is rebuilding its industrial base. You're seeing Apple and others building massive manufacturing in the United States. Sure, a lot of it is AI warehouses and server farms and all of this kind of stuff. But still, that's coming home now, using tariffs, and they're reshoring as tools of sovereignty in the United States. Beijing is doing the same thing, building alternatives to the dollar system. What we're witnessing is nothing short of a fight over the next world reserve structure. The U.S. has embraced reciprocal tariffs and strategic industrial policy. That shifts the terms of trade. It raises the premium on secure supply. It nudges these reserve managers to suddenly diversify. Beijing now sees the shift as durable U.S. statecraft, not a passing political spasm that like Trump just woke up and did one day and then he's going to reverse it. No. This is like permanent. And I do too. I see it as a permanent move. Trump's policies will not be reversed. Like this genie is not going back into the bottle. Washington brings market power and energy dominance. Beijing brings manufacturing scale and gold-backed settlement systems. And for the first time in modern history, central banks now hold more gold than U.S. treasuries. Meanwhile, back home, America's fiscal picture is terrible. It's terribly grim. I know the MAGA guys can spin it any way they want, but the national debt just hit $37.6 trillion, on its way to 38. Interest payments have crossed $1 trillion a year, more than our entire defense budget. Projections show debt to GDP climbing to 102.2% by late 2026. That's terrible. That's how unsustainable this system has become. This is an economic system that's facing collapse. There's really no other way to see it. I don't know how you see it any other way. The government shutdown drags on right now. Courts are blocking layoffs. The Supreme Court's operations are scaled back. The Supreme Court closed public access. Funding shortages are threatening court delays across the country. These hurdles, which are a judicial overreach, hamper Trump's agenda right now, echoing sort of a Nixon-era tactics under the 1976 National Emergencies Act. The deep state is fighting Trump's reforms tooth and nail. We learned this week, by the way, that George Soros is once again funding these protests in Portland and Chicago. And all the ones you saw in Washington, D.C., 200,000 people in Washington, D.C., oh yeah. They just came out organically all on their own. Yeah, right. Sure. So yes, the next 12 days are going to be unforgettable. Trump's MAGA movement, Xi Jinping's Chinese Communist Party are staring each other down. At the same moment, this dollar system is cracking. Trump knows this. This is like his Hail Mary moment here. What Trump and China do next will forever change this country, in my opinion. So that's the news update part of today.
Group releasing data that shows Russia has been supplying fighter jets, or there's a deal in place to supply 48 advanced Su-35 aircraft to Iran in the lead up, what to many believe is going to be a round two with Israel. When asked about, Sergei Lavrov himself had this to say: Russia will meet Iran's military needs despite sanctions. He didn't specify what that would be. They're not going to listen to sanctions, they're not going to follow them. We will develop military and technical cooperation with Iran despite UN sanctions. We have no restrictions.
A Su-35 aircraft sale has long been in the works for Iran. And from what we know, it was delayed primarily because Iran was dragging their feet. That there were, at one point, a year ago more, there were trainers because, Russia is very methodical. It makes sure that the pilots of the prospective nation buying them are fully up to speed first, on trainer aircraft before they graduate up to the most advanced, because you don't want to lose one of them in training, quite obviously. But then Iran didn't carry forward the deal. Russia was waiting on that, and the Su-35s aren't being used so extensively during the Ukraine conflict that Russia is certainly perfectly capable of meeting, the terms of such a deal. But it's going to be a process, just so you understand that, right? If Su-35s did, let's say, arrive in Tehran next week, which is not likely, but Iranian pilots would not be able to fly those off into the sky to confront Israel or the United States any more than Ukrainian pilots a year ago were able to jump in F-16s and fly into the contact line in Ukraine. Considerably, the Su-35 is a much more advanced aircraft as well. But we've heard Iranian officials in the last 2 weeks talk about S-400s also being on the way, of MiG-29s, right, and a older but capable aircraft, roughly comparable to the Russian F-16, either already in Iran. There have been sightings of them in Iran, or on the way. And I'm sure other supplies. Russia has been clear before that it would meet the military needs of Iran, and that it was Iran that was, not interested, at least until the last attack by Israel and the United States. Now there's some indications that Iran is going through. Now, Iran is what Putin described as a difficult country to be friends with, right? They have their pride. They have a belief in their own sovereignty and independence, and it's understandable. They don't want to be particularly dependent on any one country. And it's also understandable that they would be hesitant about depending too much on Russia. In the past, Russia and Iran have, in the distant past, have had confrontations. In the more recent past, if you want to go back to around 2010, when Dmitry Medvedev was president, and Russia and China both agreed to sanctions against Iran, although, to be fair, that was probably mostly because that was what would have forestalled a U.S. attack on Iran at the time. But there was a deal to deliver S-400s to Iran, and or was it S-300s? One of the two systems, an advanced air defense system to Iran, and Russia kept Iran waiting for years because of these sanctions, and it was mostly, of course, to please the U.S. and Israel, because at that time, the policy of the Russian government was to try to blend into the West, right? That's what they wanted. So it is understandable that Iran would fear trusting and depending on another country too much. Russia is not the country it was in 2010. And I actually certainly agree with what your last guest was talking about being locked in a permanent conflict with the West. And if the Kremlin doesn't understand that now, then they should, and they had better catch up with the game. But I think they do, or at least enough of the people in the Kremlin do. And the truth of the matter is, if Russia and China and Iran and other countries, right, North Korea, Venezuela, so forth, do not hang together now, they will be picked off one by one, right? The U.S. sees a closing geopolitical window of opportunity to extend and maintain its hegemony before the global transfer of wealth via trade results in far too strong China, Russia, and other countries for them to, go into those countries' backyards. And for China, it's probably already too late for that. Iran was obviously targeted a few months ago, right? There was a belief that a decapitation strike, together with Israeli intelligence activities on the ground, would bring down the Israeli government. The Iranian government. It did not. And the decapitation strikes were only partially successful. And whatever Mossad was cooking up for covert action and terrorists and separatists and whatever on the ground was nowhere near enough. On top of that, Iran's long-range strikes eventually exhausted and overwhelmed Israeli and Western air defenses over Israel, because the single greatest Achilles heel of the U.S. and the West right now is their over-reliance on one less than perfect air defense system, the Patriot, and their critical shortage of the PAC-3 interceptors for the Patriot. And that is ultimately why they had to call off the last war on Iran. Trump came in, dropped some bombs, declared victory, and declared a ceasefire. And because they didn't have enough air defense interceptors, and air defense was already being overwhelmed. And that is why it will be difficult for them to begin another war, because I can't imagine in just a few months they've built up enough. We know their production rate of PAC-3 interceptors. It's 600 a year by Raytheon, right? So they must, if they are to begin a new war against Iran, then they must have some new cunning plan to end it quickly. Another decapitation strike, some type of color revolution on the ground, or maybe they're sure they can target and hit all of Iran's missile launchers.
Supposedly, Israel has been sending a message via Russia to Iran saying that they don't want to attack. Even the foreign minister of Iran has said that a phone call between Netanyahu and Vladimir Putin led to Netanyahu wanting to tell Iran that they are not going to attack. Araghchi, the foreign minister, said they're perfectly capable of deception, and look at the ceasefire now. Not even 24 hours in Israel is killing Palestinians.
Yeah, I don't know who you would consider more untrustworthy, Netanyahu or Trump, but I can't throw either of them. And so, I certainly wouldn't trust them at all. And there's no reason to, right? Iran was lured into a attempted surprise attack last time because they engaged in diplomacy with the United States. Hamas leaders were just assassinated in Qatar while being there on the process, the pretext of examining a new U.S. deal. And already we see, this ceasefire was always going to last up until they got, the hostage exchange. And then, there was never any chance really of it lasting more than that. There was absolutely no way that Israel was ever going to allow Arab or Indonesian peacekeepers on the ground in their greater Zion, So it's not a surprise. And while there are military considerations, like I said, why it would be very difficult, if not prohibitive, for the U.S. and Israel to engage right now into another conflict with Iran. And the biggest one is the Achilles heel is air defense, and specifically the lack of air defense interceptors. We have no reason to believe that they have somehow magically ramped up production, and it will make it very hard. That doesn't mean that they won't settle on some cunning plan that they believe will work, like they did the first time, right? That's the danger, their lack of military realism about their capabilities there. But we can say that about many things before. So Israel can say that, but it certainly doesn't mean that Iran or Russia or anyone else should trust them for, even a split second on this. I certainly would. But the reality is even if everything we've heard, right? Russia has been sending military transports to Iran. There are plenty of reports on that in the past 2 weeks. We don't know what they contain, right? It could be normal, already contracted stuff. It could be brand new S-400s and what else, air defense systems. But regardless, this will take time. This is not something they can erect in a day, right? What Russia has is an integrated, interconnected, multi-layered air defense and electronic warfare network, the best in the world, as has certainly been demonstrated over the past few years. And while not 100%, it's as close as anything, it's the best in the world. And what happened in Israel, clearly shows that their Iron Dome and David's Boomerang and everything else wasn't all that it was cracked up to be. Meanwhile, Russia's air defense has withstood, multiple rounds of Western cruise missiles and ballistic missiles and daily hundreds of drone attacks directed by U.S. satellites and everything else. So, but it's not going to magically appear overnight. It will take time to construct it, to integrate it, and to train up the personnel to properly use these advanced systems. So if the U.S. and Israel intend another deceptive, quick attack, then anything that Russia and or China, because there have also been some reports of Chinese military transports coming to Iran, will only help so much. It takes time. Whether we're talking the air defense, whether we're talking Russian fighter aircraft, it's not something that can be integrated overnight. As we've clearly seen is impossible to do for the West's proxy in Ukraine. All these fancy systems have to be operated by their own personnel. And even then, without integrated systems, they don't work very, interconnected, multi-layered systems, they have very limited effectiveness.
I have a question, Mark. When it comes to this question of especially the older models, the MiGs and even the air defenses that Russia is supplying Iran, I've heard reports out of Iran that have said that there are like Russian engineers and logistical support. Is this true? And does that at least help speed up the process for these kind of weapons to be more ready-made or ready to use in combat? Or is it that it still takes some time? I think Israel is probably a little concerned that they might not have a surprise attack up their sleeve this time around. But nonetheless, as you said, and as everyone has come on this show, and I truly believe this too, something is going to come eventually, because Netanyahu has not let go, or Israel has not let go of this regime change goal. So your thoughts about this?
Yeah. So, I mean, doubtless there are Russian military and military technical people on the ground. That is actually an essential. It's not something that would necessarily speed up the process. It is an essential part of the process. It wouldn't happen at all without it. I mean, we know that Russia has lots of personnel on the ground. For instance, it's scientists and engineers and workers at Bushehr, Iran's nuclear power plant. And even during the last strikes, Russia was quite clear that they were not removing their people from Bushehr. And they warned Israel, don't you dare. Our people are there. Do not hit that, right? And they didn't. But regardless, I do not expect a situation where Russia declares military forces on the ground in Iran as some type of a human tripwire, right? That is not the type of strategic partnership agreement that Russia and Iran have, as far as we know. It has no mutual defense clause like the one with North Korea does. Although again, we're told that Russia offered that to Iran and they turned it down. Likewise with the Chinese. Unfortunately, the level of alliance, trust, and integration between the three of them is still something that is not what it should be, and it needs to be. And hopefully they will make progress on making it so. Because if they don't, like I said, they will be picked off. But it was discovered, that Russia was a lot harder. The Blinken-Sullivan administration discovered that as much as they imagined they could take down Russia and pivot to China, that they couldn't. And then obviously Israel and the Trump administration believed they could they could quickly take down Iran, right? Pivot to Iran and then have Europe hold Russia in place and pivot to China. And obviously that didn't work out either. Now it appears that the Trump administration is looking for some low-hanging fruit for a victory, right, in Venezuela. But if they did that, right, Venezuela obviously has a much smaller and less capable military than Iran, right, or certainly more so, than Russia. They have very limited. They do have some Russian S-300s, some older systems, I believe, and some older air defense. But I mean, no one has any doubt in their minds that if the U.S. moved in force on Venezuela, that they could decapitate, with decapitation strikes, take out the Venezuelan government, and with the help of opposition oligarchs and the like, who would raise their own right-wing armies and so forth, that they could take out the Venezuelan government. The question then becomes, can they actually, though, occupy the country and govern it? That's another story, and depends on the passion of the Venezuelan people who support Maduro for the continuation of the Bolivarian revolution. I'm not in a place to judge by that. I will only say that I'm always afraid in such situations because the U.S., the UK, Mossad, even Turkish intelligence involved have proven extremely successful in the past at covert co-option of top generals and political figures and getting troops to stand down. I mean, they had some 90% of the Syrian army, right, of 200,000 strong, that basically stood down and laid down their weapons and ran home under the order of their generals and officers. If they can do that in Syria, then unfortunately, their possibility of doing that in Venezuela, exists as well. So I don't know. I have not been to Venezuela, and I can't say. But people who were on the ground in Syria didn't see that one coming either. So we don't know. We don't know. But it's doubtless that the Trump administration is probably looking for an easy win. They see Venezuela as a low-hanging fruit. It has the largest proven oil reserves in the world. And you can bet, that there are people in the U.S. and other Western deep states, the blob, if you will, who look at this like a geopolitical chess match. Oh, you think you're going to take our pawn or our knight or whatever in Ukraine away from us? Well, bam, there's your pawn in Syria. Bam, there's your pawn in Nepal. Bam, Venezuela,
Indonesia, right? Indonesia,
right.
Everywhere. Yeah,
We're in the long game already. I mean, we are in the conflict for global world order, which is taking place militarily, economically, cyber. Certainly in the information sphere, right? It's not just one conflict; it is a multiplicity of conflicts, as is appropriate for trying to stop the birth of a multipolar world order. We're in that game. We're well in that game. And Venezuela, what's going on there is just another part, one more battle in what will be ultimately a decades-long conflict, and that will all be blessedly lucky that doesn't end in nuclear Armageddon at the end of it.
You know, Israel has already taken out 7 Palestinians, you know, not within 24 hours of that ceasefire. And then, Mark, you had this the incredible optics of Trump's very brief visit to the Knesset in Israel, as well as, of course, that absolutely pathetic summit that we saw in Egypt. And I want to just play a bit of this commentary about weapons, which speaks to, I think, this trust element in this broader conflagration you're talking about. Because when you hear the U.S. president talk like this is the one thing that Trump does. He just tells you straight up that this is all part of the agenda. Here we go.
I can tell you we have weapons that nobody's ever dreamt of. I only hope we never have to use them. I rebuilt the military. I was proud to do it, but some of the things I hated to do, I hated certain of the weapons because the level of power is so enormous, it's so dangerous, so bad. But we have to do what we have to do. We make the best weapons in the world, and we've got a lot of them. And we've given a lot to Israel, frankly. And Bibi would call me so many times, can you get me this weapon, that weapon, that weapon? Some of them I never heard of, Bibi, and I made them. But we'd get them here, wouldn't we? And they are the best. They are the best. But you used them well. It also takes.
So you used them well. We gave them weapons, of course.
Military. I don't know what those weapons are. I have no idea. You know.
All the bluster about them being the best weapons and all of that. But the truth here is that he is admitting straight up, giving Israel weapons and saying they use them well. And how do they use them? Well, they use them on Gaza.
We facilitated the genocide.
The genocide, and of course the war with Iran, and of course everything
and
else.
Lebanon,
Lebanon and Syria.
Yeah. Okay. I mean, this is a neo-colonial diktat. I don't expect it to last any more than the. Remember, we went through all of this actually before. I mean, there was a very similar ceasefire when Trump first came into office, and that fell apart even sooner than this one did, because at least they pushed through the hostage exchange. Although I understand that the Palestinian hostages that Israel has, it has already reneged and is deciding who they will let go and who they will not let go now.
Welcome back to Legitimate Targets, everybody. I hope you're all having a great day. It's been a while since we had Scott Ritter on the show, but he was, I think, one of the first guests that we ever had on this show a year ago, as of this week. So I'm honored to have him back, as always, to talk, and we got a lot to talk about. So unless you've been living under a rock, you probably know Scott Ritter, former U.S. Marine Intelligence Officer and United Nations Weapons Inspector, and hardcore truth teller when it comes to all geopolitical issues that we cover on this show. So, Scott, thank you so much for joining me. How you doing?
I'm doing great. Thanks. Yourself?
Good. I want to start off asking you about a new report that just came in before we went live. Ynet News, Israeli media reports that Israel, Netanyahu in particular, in a conversation with Putin last week as these Russian military aircraft are landing in Iran, they had this call, and Netanyahu said, look, I want you to convey a message to the Iranians that we are not looking for war. But everything besides that kind of indicates they are. What do you make of this?
Well, I can say that I had the honor and privilege of being in a meeting with the Iranian president and the Iranian foreign minister a couple weeks ago, and listened to this man talk about these very type situations. If all you have to go on when is what other people think of things, I'm here to tell you right now, that's not a good way of going through life. Because prior to meeting the Iranian president, if I had gone off of what I read, especially from, Iranian, sort of a lot of the Iranian voices that resonate here, he's a weak man, he's a sellout, he's compromised, he doesn't have the best interests of Iran in heart, et cetera, et cetera. The man I met was not that. He was very strong, very confident, and very much in love with Iran and was working to promote things. But he's also a man who said that they believed that Israel was going to attack them and that they were ready for this, that they weren't looking for war, but they were prepared for war. He's also a man who was honest that the 12-day war that was fought back in June hurt. He said the Israelis hurt them bad, killed their senior military leadership, killed nuclear guys, blew up nuclear facilities. Damage was done. It was painful. He also was honest that sanctions hurt the Iranian people. It's not good. They're not, the Iranian government understands the consequences of actions that lead to sanctions, lead to problems. And he said that this had created some fractures in Iranian society before the 12-day war. There was a division between the presidency and the supreme leader. And for people in the West to go, wait, how can that be? Iran is a dictatorship of the theocracy, is it not? I'm like, well, no, it's actually a democracy. They have a constitution and the president's a pretty powerful dude. And so it's not a good thing to have a difference between the president and the theocrats. But what he said is because of the 12-day war, Iran is more united today than they've ever been. They are stronger. Whatever fractures there, they've been super glued back together and they ain't breaking. And so there's a lot of confidence that's there. And one of the reasons why there's confidence is that we have to deal with certain realities. Yes, the Israelis hurt the Iranians. That tends to happen when you get a surprise attack. I mean, the Japanese hurt the United States Harbor. They hit us with a Sunday punch on Sunday, and it hurt. But we sort of picked ourselves up, dusted ourselves off, and almost 4 years later in Tokyo Bay, the Japanese surrendered unconditionally to us because we beat them. Israel hit Iran, but 12 days later, it was Benjamin Netanyahu picking up the phone, begging Donald Trump to intervene to bring about a ceasefire. Why? Because the Sunday punch didn't knock Iran out. It hurt Iran, but Iran adapted. Again, a lot of people only read what the West wants them to read about this war. Read what the Iranians are saying. They've been pretty open about this. It was fascinating. I don't know if you saw the program where the Iranian pilots were talking about how they were intercepting the Israelis, not to shoot them down. They're not claiming they shot down the Israeli Air Force, but the Israelis to attack, they were using this missile system called the Blue Streak, I believe. There's a red streak and a silver streak, a black streak, but the Blue Streak was the main one. To do this, you have to fly an attack profile. And so you're coming in and you're getting everything locked in, then you're going to release the missile and it's going to go to its target. But as they're flying that attack profile, the Iranian Air Force is coming in and locking in, getting their target acquisition radars to lock in on the Israelis. The Israelis had to break off their attacks, which means this idea of Israeli air supremacy, where they're getting to do whatever they want, wasn't the case. It actually, near the end of the war, the majority of Israeli attacks were being broken off because the Iranian Air Force, which everybody thought had been destroyed, was up and flying and working and intercepting. So that's something. The Israelis got their knockout punch because for 10 years, the Mossad had built this network of, covert operatives who were building drone factories. And they had these drone launched vehicles that they were running around and they flew them off and they hit missiles, they assassinated people, the whole thing. Well, that's gone. All those Mossad dudes are dead, hung by the neck until dead. All the factories have been discovered and destroyed. That's gone. The Israelis were able to hurt Tehran because they were able to fly through Syria into Azerbaijan and then come in through the Caspian Sea and attack from the rear, which was unprotected. That won't happen again. The Russians have been flying, as you insinuated, nonstop heavy lift cargo. They're bringing in radars, missile defenses, and aircraft. There's modern versions of the MiG-29 flying over there with advanced search radars. That won't happen again. So all the things that gave Israel the advantage for their knockout blow, they don't exist anymore. Meanwhile, the Israeli missile defense system, which failed, hasn't been repaired. I mean, it's not any better. It's the same that it was. They're still trying to replace the missiles. The United States, we brought in Aegis class destroyers and cruisers. We pretty much shot through our SM-3s and SM-6s, our missile interceptors. We fired a year's worth of production in 12 days. And there's nothing to replace it. The THAAD is supposed to be this great system, doesn't work. And that's against Iranian missiles that were 20 or 30 years old. Near the end of the war, Iran was firing new missiles, not as many, but they weren't getting hit. They were coming through. They were hitting targets that hurt. And the Israelis now have admitted this hurt. That's why Netanyahu made the phone call. If Israel were to attack Iran today, it would go very bad for Israel very quickly. And if the United States were to intervene on behalf of Iran, it'd go very bad for the United States very quickly. So even though the Iranian president is saying that he's ready for a war and he believes one's going to come, this Ynet story rings true. Because while Russia is providing the support to Iran, that means that Russia has the ear of the Iranians. And what Netanyahu wanted to say is, we're not going to attack you. And I agree with that assessment, because I don't see the Israelis having any way to accomplish this mission. They're weaker than they were when they started the 12-day war. And Iran is stronger than they were, because Iran's learned a lot of lessons. So I do think the story rings true. And this is good news. This is really good news, because what the Middle East needs right now, what West Asia needs right now, is stability. And the most destabilizing part of that whole region is the potential of Israel and Iran to go to war against one another. We still have the issue of Iran's nuclear program that has to be resolved. And that's not going to be an easy thing. But right now, I think keeping Israel from initiating an attack is a good thing.
Mm-hmm. The biggest thing that I think everyone pointed out for Iran that they needed to fix, and this was a subject of conversation before the war began, was I don't know the exact technical terms, but people were bringing up the question of having a very strong Iranian air defense that was integrated with the Russian system in some way, shape, or form. I don't know. I haven't seen any indication that they've done this, or that it could. I don't even know if it could be done that quickly. But you think Iran could fix some of their air defense problems in the short time that's passed since the 12-day war?
I think, again, the Iranians are reticent about talking about certain things because, they don't want people to know how good they are or how vulnerable they are. But one of the things that I have been led to believe is that when the Mossad-controlled drones were going out and striking critical air defense systems, that rather than keep the systems in play, Iran withdrew the systems, shut them down, got them out of harm's way to preserve capabilities. Because you're being hit from a vector that was unpredicted and can't be defended against using the systems. So they preserve them. So the ability of Iran to, I don't know if you hear my dogs, but they're going crazy right now because the town has decided they're going to repave the road in front. And so there's people wandering around and the dogs are taking umbrage at that. But I apologize to your audience for this. But I think the Iranians have the ability to reconstitute their air defense more quickly than might have suspected, given what happened during the war. Because I think they preserved a lot of it. they had already been talking with the Russians about S-300s and bringing in Pantsir and other things. Not that it was unknown to them, but getting disparate architecture to communicate with one another is it doesn't happen overnight. But I would say this, that the Russians and the Iranians appear to be talking and to have been talking for some time now. And given what happened in the 12-day war, I think this would be one of their top priorities. And if Russian scientific minds and Iranian scientific minds, all of whom are attuned to the reality of air defense, talk, I don't think Russia's pouring in equipment just to have it sit in a warehouse. I think Russia's pouring into equipment because an architecture framework has been agreed upon, and that this equipment's going to plug in and be ready to be used. This would require training of Iranian experts. Again, I don't know if that's happened, but the security agreement between Russia and Iran has been ratified by both parties. It wasn't ratified in the lead up to the 12-day war. And there are classified annexes there which I assume, based upon similar agreements that have existed in the past. And, Russia is a nation of habit, and a lot of their habit is, comes from Soviet times. I'm very familiar, for instance, with what the Russians did with the Iraqis about Scud missiles and how Iraqi troops would go to Samarra and be trained in the missile defense force and would, use their equipment to proof it, and all the Russian advisors would come in. I think that's what a classified annex looks like. And I'm fairly confident to say that Iranians have probably been in the appropriate schools in Russia receiving the training, that they've tested these in live fire exercises in Russia, so that the first time when they fall on their equipment, it won't be the first time they've operated. If they ever have to use it in combat, they'll know what to do. It won't be, oh no, what do we do? And I think the Israelis understand this too. The Israelis are fully cognizant of what's been happening. And so I do believe that Iran's air defense system is up and running and is being strengthened as we speak. And the Iranians learned. I mean, you now have to have counter-drone capability deployed with your air defense. That's just a part of the reality of modern warfare. They didn't have that before, and they lost some very valuable assets. They preserved a lot of their Air Force, but there were some limitations on how they could use their Air Force. They had to operate out of Western Iran and approach the Israelis, get the Israelis closer. They had to yield the Tehran airspace because they didn't have the ability to deal with, aircraft coming out of Azerbaijan. Now you have modern MiG-29s flying over Tehran. They've sealed off the Caspian Sea. I think the Iranians are in a very good place, and I think the Israelis know this.
And one more question about the Russia-Iran relationship. You've mentioned the modern MiG-29s. There was also the leaked Rostec, order for 2026 to 2028 MiG-29s and Su-35s. I'm assuming that means that they don't have the higher tech aircraft yet. We haven't seen any satellite proof of this. Presumably, this would be coming later on. Is that what the order insinuated?
I think the fact that you talk about an order that talks about advanced MiG-29s coming in 2026 and beyond, and here we are in 2025, and we have advanced MiG-29s flying over Tehran airspace. The Russians have acted by not developing export models, but I think the aircraft flying over Tehran right now are Russian frontline MiG-29 fighters, the best that Russia has. And Russia has stepped up to the plate because there was a lot of perception that Russia wasn't doing its job, and that Russia was going to yield the Iranian market to China, etc. I think Russia delivered the best MiG-29s in their arsenal to Tehran. Su-35 is different. The complexity of the system, the fact that it is a frontline system in the ongoing conflict with Ukraine, so there's competing requirements, that this might be something that isn't available today to the Iranians. To train an Iranian pilot to be an Su-35 pilot is a completely different thing. To maintain the Su-35, things of that nature, you need to send people to schools. These schools are long, and you need to have the systems available. So while I don't believe the Iranians are going to wait until 2029 to get the Su-35, in fact, when you look at some of these cargo planes are flying out of cities associated with Su-35 production. And so I think you're starting to see Su-35 infrastructure deployed to Iran because you have to create the ability to absorb the aircraft. So I think the Russians gave the MiG-29s there. That's fulfillment. They're putting in MiG-35 or Su-35 support infrastructure. And who knows, maybe there's some Iranian pilots out in Novosibirsk somewhere getting trained on the Su-35 so that when the aircraft are ready, the Iranians are ready to use them. You have infrastructure in place, you have trained pilots, but it takes time. To rush this is to invite disaster. Because if you rush a capability that people aren't ready to use, then you're going to lose that capability if called upon to do so. The last thing either Iran or Russia would want is to have Iranian pilots in Su-35s and have them shot down or lost in an operational incident because they weren't ready. The Russians are professionals, and so are the Iranians, and they will do what is necessary to be prepared to employ the Su-35 to its full capacity when the time comes, and they're not going to rush that process.
How much do you think the Gaza ceasefire potentially implicates this conflict with Iran? Because obviously Netanyahu's got his personal court dealings with his wife. He's also got to think about the hardline far rights that are saying, this is terrible. We're going to vote against the Gaza ceasefire, the hostage deal. Smotrich came out and said that. Does Netanyahu have anyone to fall back on? Because he hasn't since October 7, 2023, on the more liberal side of Israeli politics. Does he have anyone to fall back on at a moment when possibly this coalition that he's depended on might be fracturing yet again?
I don't know. That's a $1 million question. That's a good question. But he has no choice. The fact of the matter is, this peace deal has come together for a number of real reasons. One, Hamas won this war. I mean, people don't understand it. The peace deal is actually almost point for point the plan that Hamas has been putting forward when we talk about a ceasefire. Go back to October 2023, after October 7th, when they were first talking about a ceasefire in November. The points articulated by Hamas are the points that are the heart of the Trump plan. So what changed? Hamas wasn't defeated. What changed was Israel. Israel has come to the realization it can't win this war, can't win militarily, and politically they're more isolated internationally than they've ever been. One of the Hamas strategies articulated, again, I wrote about this in November of 2023, was to let Israel be Israel, that the best weapon Hamas had to defeat Israel was Israel, because Israel would commit genocide. They knew that. We knew about Daiwa Doctrine. We knew about mowing the grass, but it was all theory. Now we got to see it in reality. And the world now has come to the recognition that Israel is a murderous, genocidal state. This is why we see the International Court of Justice make the decisions of the International Criminal Court actually indicting. We see Europe starting to recognize a Palestinian state, things that never would have happened before. But more importantly, from Netanyahu's perspective, Israel's losing the United States. And Donald Trump has said Israel doesn't control Congress like it used to. It used to have an iron grip. It's weakening. And the whole Charlie Kirk thing, without going too far down that rabbit hole, showed that the Christian evangelical Christian Zionist movement was starting to question the unquestioned support of Israel. And support was bleeding off quick. So Netanyahu had to agree to these terms because he doesn't have any choice to continue down the path he was going would, not only turn the world against him. He was ready. He said, he gave a speech last month. He said, Israel is more isolated today than it ever has been, and Israel will have to become self-sufficient. But Israel can't be self-sufficient. Self-sufficiency means the U.S. taxpayer underwrites the cost of Israel, which he had every right to believe would continue because of the control that the pro-Israeli lobby has. But today, that's not guaranteed anymore. And if you lose America, you lose everything. And it's not just Netanyahu that's realizing this. Yes, you have the hardliners, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and others. They are never going to be part of a peace solution. They don't believe in peace. Netanyahu is a political realist. He knows what you just alluded to, that if he is moved out of office and there isn't a deal in place, he's going to be arrested, taken to court. He and his wife will be found guilty of corruption, and he will probably die in an Israeli prison. So can he build a coalition? I think he has to build a coalition. Benny Gantz is a guy that I think he could do business with in the short term. Gantz could view a coalition with Netanyahu as a stepping stone to him becoming prime minister in a post-Netanyahu reality, where Netanyahu leaves the post with immunity not only for the crimes that he's committed, he and his wife, prior to October 7th, but immunity from any criminal liability for his failure on October 7th. What happened on October 7th. Maybe he goes into retirement in Miami. His son has spent a lot of time avoiding military service, buying up properties in Miami, and maybe that's where Bibi and Sarah you come to. They'll have to do their own laundry because he won't be the prime minister anymore. He can't bring his dirty laundry for the State Department to do. But that this new reality that Americans are starting to question the unquestioned support of Israel is something Israel's never had to deal with before. And I do think it creates, new political realities that have to be taken into account by anybody in Israel who understands that if you lose America, Israel's done. It's finished. And so if that means that Benny Gantz has to make a short-term, coalition of convenience with Netanyahu so that Netanyahu can survive the right-wing parties fleeing, so be it. Then if Gantz is smart, he creates the conditions that allow Netanyahu to leave Israel, avoid prosecution, and now he's prime minister, which is the objective of any politician, is to become top dog. I'm not saying that's happening. I'm not saying there's evidence that that's happening. I'm saying there's potential for this to happen. The idea that Netanyahu is held hostage now, the way that he was during war, when there was no chance for peace, when Gantz would never join a Netanyahu coalition, that doesn't exist. These people can quit the party, and if Netanyahu is clever, and again, this is where Donald Trump comes in, because Trump can make a phone call. Call up Gantz, say, you're in a coalition.
Yep.
Continued American military support hinges on you joining the coalition. You're going to join this coalition, and you're going to do what I'm going to tell you to do. You're going to not prosecute this guy. You're going to get him out of the country. There's going to be a deal, and then you and I are going to work for a longer, broader peace. And I think Trump now has there's a reason for him to do this now. He's invested a lot of political capital. This is his peace deal. This is his Nobel Peace Prize. Even if he doesn't get it, he's going to award it to himself. But he can't do that if this falls apart, and he can't have Netanyahu sabotage this. So there's a lot of incentive for Donald Trump and the United States government to become very creative on the pressure points that can be put on Israel to ensure that this plan survives.
Well, let's hope for it. I can't say I'm extremely hopeful, but I will continue to hope. And
that's all we got, man. That's all we got.
if for nothing else than Trump's own vanity, this could work. So Scott Ritter, thank you so much for joining me. Exceptional commentary and analysis as always. And you're 100% right also about the point about Hamas winning. I mean, this is what Kissinger always said. If you can't kill the guerrillas, if you can't completely vanquish them, then they are the victors. And The only question is the disarmament, and I don't know how viable that even is, even if it's a talking point that they say they're going to It's like, what are you going to do?
Well, they've agreed to it. But I'm sure there's heavy caveats attached to that require behavioral modification on the part of Israel that to date they've been unable to do. But this is where Donald Trump's ego comes into play. He wants that damn Nobel Peace Prize.
We'll see. Scott Ritter.
They will establish settlement in Gaza, and that would bring security. How can you argue that you're going to disarm Hamas? And Donald Trump said that the United States is going to do that. Here is what he said, Alex.
Told them we want to disarm, and they will disarm. And if they don't disarm, we will disarm them. And it'll happen quickly and perhaps violently. But they will disarm. Do you understand me?
Yes. You say
because everyone says, oh, well, they won't disarm. They will disarm. And I spoke to Hamas, and I said, you're going to disarm, right? Yes, sir, we're going to disarm. That's what they told me. They will disarm, or we will disarm them. Got it? Okay.
What is the deadline?
I cannot believe that without putting conditions out there, Hamas would decide about it, would disarm. You're taking that, Alex.
Well, the day before, I think he said something exactly the opposite. You know, he was on the flight, on the plane, and the journalists were asking him about disarming Hamas, and he was saying, well, you know, they are in, they have to maintain order there. So for the time being, they're going to be, in charge, and they have to remain armed because they need to maintain order in the Gaza Strip. It seems to me that Trump treats all this situation as a very transitory thing. I struggle to explain it to myself, but it seems to me that Trump has been formed, as a public persona through American show business, where you say something at a given moment that will please whatever audience you think you're addressing. And then it doesn't really matter because everybody's attention spans are extremely short. So whatever I say today to this public, we move on, and then I'm going to say something else to the next public. And so that makes it extremely difficult to read Trump, what his real intentions are. But let's say that in the case of this peace deal, last time you and I spoke, I was deeply pessimistic about it. I was wondering, why is he bothering even? This is never going to hold. I think he's just buying time to avoid going to war against Iran. That was my idea. Now it seems to me that he did manage to get a very significant buy-in for practically all the parties involved. Iran is not there, the Russians are not there, but all the Arab countries are there, and they seem to be extremely serious about this peace. Hamas has committed to it. Even the Israeli cabinet has committed to it. And so whatever he just said in that video clip that you showed, I don't know if that needs to be taken seriously. Because also, if I think about how are you going to disarm Hamas? Exactly how are you going to do that? I don't see the way, because Israel has been trying to do this for more than 2 years, and they haven't succeeded. What is Trump going to do? Is he going to send US troops? And what are the American troops going to do that the Israeli troops were not able to do? How are they going to do it? So it seems to me that Trump is just signaling what he wants to signal at this time to this audience, and there's no intention behind it. There's no commitment to it, because he counts with people's short attention span. 1 week later, nobody's going to remember any of this, and we're going to be dealing with the next thing. So I can't take this seriously, and I've already, I've been trying already for months not to even pay attention to things that Trump says, to try instead to pay attention to what his administration does and what effects seem to be gathering on the ground.
You wrote a piece, which I shared it on X, about the British, how British would influence the case of the peace in the Middle East, and how the game of the Brits there. What's your point? And I think many people should know about it. We have audience here who have never maybe heard about your piece or didn't read it. What is the main point that you're making, which I found it so valid and important?
Well, for a very long time now, I've been kind of finding the hand of the British establishment in every crisis theater everywhere around the world. They're always there, and they're there in a very quiet and discreet way. You don't find British military. You don't find necessarily many known British government officials, but you do find a lot of these intelligence assets, NGOs, charities, the British Council, private companies, and so forth. And they're always there. And it seems to me that Trump took them by surprise with this peace deal. That they didn't see it coming, they didn't expect it, and it caught them off guard. Because let's go back 100 years. The British Empire created the Zionist project. And then they moved a lot of pieces into place. It was a very long-term, complex game to create the State of Israel, and they did it. They created the State of Israel, and they created it for a reason. And that reason wasn't to provide a homeland for the long-suffering Jewish people. It was a cynical play for the ends of the British Empire. And the alumni of the Alfred Milner's Round Table articulated what the reason was. They said basically, if Britain is going to remain as a maritime empire, it needs to seed this region with a particularly patriotic stock, and they weren't able to do this with the Arabs. So they decided to bring Jews there, and then to create the Jewish State of Israel. And the whole objective of the Jewish State of Israel there was to keep the whole region destabilized, perpetually at war, because it's a strategically important region. And rather than attempting to control it militarily, which you couldn't even theoretically, nobody has that many troops and police, you just keep the region in a state of chaos perpetually, because that makes it easier to play one tribe, one country, one region against the other, while you secretly deal with everybody. It's the typical balance of powers, British geopolitics. Now, you're involved. Everybody knows you're involved, and now you have to explain why is this reason perpetually at war. And then the narrative is always like, oh, it's so complicated, centuries of hatreds, very primitive, irrational people. You can't negotiate with them. They're always at each other's throats. And like, what can we do? It's just like that, and we're trying to do our best, but you see, these people are beyond hope. And then Trump comes in, and after 10 months of his presidency, he gets everybody around the table, and he gets them to sign a peace agreement. So now this is a big blow for British diplomacy, because what is so complicated about peace that they could not figure out, that Trump did figure out? Trump, the guy that everybody loves to hate, he figured it out. So the day after Trump announced the peace on the 10th October, what was the Sunday? Sunday was the 12th, right? Yeah, 2 days after. British Secretary of Education comes on Sky News for an interview, and she says, we shaped this peace behind the scenes because it's the right thing to do and it's in our interest and blah, 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 blah. And then the interviewer asked her, like, okay, so you did all this stuff behind the scenes, like what? And then she couldn't explain. She couldn't, then she sounds like a high school student who's doing a book report about a book that they never read. He's just like, well, it's very complicated and, but, good on the Americans that they contributed to. So they're trying to take credit because it's massively embarrassing. It puts them in under very bad light. And then, Trump even had them all fly to Egypt, where, he put them through another very light, very subtle humiliation ritual, especially Keir Starmer, to make it very obvious who did make the peace happen and who is just a bystander and observer. And so I think that the British Education Secretary, Bridget, I forget her last name now, she probably caused a lot more damage by trying to claim credit for this peace than had she said nothing. Because by disingenuously claiming credit, she only drew attention to the fact that they didn't contribute anything. In fact, for decades, they've been dissimulating how, it's just impossible to make peace here because, all these people, they're, so irrational, so primitive, so violent, and the issues are so incredibly complicated that, even we sophisticated people with our posh accent can't possibly do anything about it.
Yeah. Bridget Phillipson. Yeah.
Bridget Phillipson. Yeah. There you go. Thank you.
Yeah. Alex, I think when it comes, I don't know if you've read that Iran is just changing its behavior, because before, Iran has been under sanctions for many years, and they know how to deal with the sanctions when it comes to the exportation of the oil and gas and all of this. But recently they have decided to behave differently. What does that mean? The tankers which they used to use, other countries' flags, today they're using Iranian flag. And it was so strange for many people. Why is Iran doing this? And from what I've heard from the Iranian media, because Iran is sending a sign, if you want to fight Iran, if you attack the tankers, we're ready to respond. I don't know why did it happen and how did it happen in Iran? Because for many years, many people were arguing, why are we so afraid that we have to use other countries' flag? And there was a lot of arguments in Iran, and because of this, because of that, political, geopolitical, and all of these reasons. But Iran has changed. And I see something happening. It's not just about Iran, Alex. It's about Russia. It's about China. Something different is happening. They don't want to, bend. They don't want to, chicken out. This is a new attitude. Why is that happening? In the case of Iran, what is your understanding of this decision? When I follow the Iranian media, I'm so shocked with these new changes that are happening in the mind of the decision makers in Iran.
Of course, I don't know exactly, but my guess would be that they're feeling increasingly confident that they're on the right side of history and that they're on the winning side. And I think that this is the consequence of the fact, which is increasingly obvious, that the Western Empire has sustained a strategic defeat in the Middle East, in Western Asia. And that I think that this was apparent at the very least since June this year, since the 12-day war. And America's inability to defeat Houthis in Yemen. So I think that the peace that was just signed between Israel and Hamas actually makes that undeniable. It cements it, because I really see this peace as Trump basically cemented Israel's defeat. Some might say that he's protecting them from themselves, maybe, but it's becoming undeniable now. And in a way, you could even argue that he handed a victory to Hamas, because Hamas already won, but now it's in black and white. And so I think that the Western Empire sustained a strategic defeat, and now if you sail your tankers under your own flag, and they get attacked or they get confiscated, as the British and the Americans have done in the past, well, then there's no question about whose property you're stealing, and it puts the cards down on the table. So it's almost like daring them. Here it is. It's almost a glove thrown in their faces. These are our ships carrying our oil exports. I dare you to do something about it. That would be my guess, Nima. I'm not sure that I'm 100% certain, but they didn't make this change to amuse themselves. It's not for fun. There's a strategic reason for it, and it's not for the lack of confidence. It's for a greater confidence that they feel in with regards to their Western adversaries.
Because it's not just about Iran. I think they have decided together with Russia, maybe China knows about it, and because Russia is experiencing the same sort of sanctions, so they have to decide how to deal with this issue after all. And yesterday, many comments about the situation in Ukraine. Donald Trump himself, you have Scott Bessent talking about it. But still, when you look at the situation, the way that Donald Trump is picturing the situation in Ukraine, you see a lot of rhetoric. And if you change the head of Donald Trump himself, the physique of Donald Trump, and put it Joe Biden there, Alex, it seems to me that Joe Biden is talking to us. Here is what Donald Trump said yesterday.
War that he should have won that war in 1 week. He's now going to soon be into his 4th year. He's lost 1.5 million soldiers, probably close. Certainly in terms of wounded and no legs and no arms and all of the things that happen in horrible wars. It's a horrible war. It's the biggest thing that's happened since World War II in terms of death. It's bigger than any of them. I settled 8 of them. The biggest is that in terms of death. Incredible. I think India, Pakistan had great potential too. We did a great job in that one, but he's got to really settle this war. And they have long lines waiting for gasoline in Russia right now, right? They have long lines. Who thought that was going to happen? And all of a sudden, his economy is going to collapse.
No positive thing in his comments. His economy is collapsing. Russia has lost 1.5 million, soldiers. It's just, he's not talking about wounded. They've lost those people who've been killed on the battlefield. He was talking about, and later on he said that. And the other thing is the way that they're trying to put pressure on India and China. And here is what he said about India.
I was not happy that India was buying oil, and he assured me today that they will not be buying oil from Russia. That's a big stop. Now I got to get China to do the same thing.
When
I was not happy that India.
And here is Scott Bessent, the same direction, sanctioning Russia, putting pressure on Russia.
When we can't get 7 more Democratic senators across the line, but 85 U.S. senators are willing to give President Trump the authority to put up to 500% tariffs on China for the purchase of Russian oil.
You put all these pictures together. You don't see any reason, you don't see any movement on the part of the Trump administration to solve it politically through talks to understand what Russia is talking about. It's all about putting pressure on Russia and bringing Russia to its needs. Your take on that. What is your understanding of the moves that the Trump administration is trying to make?
Well, one thing that I know that they're trying to do is they want to introduce tariffs on whoever they can, and it's always a delicate matter because they're kind of assaulting the system of free trade, which is at the foundation of the Western system since the end of World War II. Basically, they're attacking the WTO rules. And there's a lot of people who will push back against them. So if you wrap it in the gift wrap of, we're going against Russia, we're punishing Russia, then that passes. If they say we want to introduce tariffs because we want to do away with the WTO rules, then that gets massive political opposition. So I think that they're being opportunistic here. Now, why do they want to introduce all these tariffs? Because, as Trump has said many times, he wants to reindustrialize the United States. He wants to bring manufacturing back home. He wants to develop the United States economically in a very different way from what has been practiced for the last several decades. But he has been attacked very savagely for that because, he's undermining the whole global economic system and he's going to do this and that. And so if you paint it all as anti-Russia measures, then everybody cheers and accepts it. And I think this is the reason why they're doing it. I don't think they're doing it because they actually want to hurt Russia, because I don't think that's going to work to begin with. It would be a little bit dumb if that was the main reason. Among other things, if you go Russia and China, India and China to stop buying Russian oil, I think you create a panic in the oil market. You might get oil go back up to over $100 a barrel, and you'd kickstart commodity price driven inflation, which then is again very bad for your own economy. So as with everything, certain things that Trump does and says, or people from his administration, to me seem so dumb. I can't possibly think that this is what they're actually doing, because you would think okay, that's really dumb. So either they are really dumb or they're doing something else, or they're doing this for other reasons that they're not telling us for some reason. And I think, this is my best explanation, but again, like we're guessing because obviously they're not going to tell us straight up. And you have to kind of connect the dots to try to arrive at the best guess. And my best guess is because this is a very major policy change that Trump is driving at, re-industrializing the United States, bringing back manufacturing, creating, manufacturing jobs. And to do that, you have to create a protected market. And the way you're going to protect it is through tariffs. And if you collect enough in tariffs, you can even play with lowering taxes, which is, it gives you like a little card to play for midterm elections. You can say like, oh, look, we have a budget surplus now and we can lower taxes. So that's my best guess, because if that were true, it would tell me that, that they have a mission, they have some kind of a strategy, and they're not stupid. If they're doing it because they're really stupid, then we're all in trouble.
Actually, when I see Pete Hegseth talking about, sending weapons to Europe, and that's why peace through strength, and
yeah, that's
you really think that Pete Hegseth is smart? I don't see this guy being smart. He seems to me that he's still working for Fox News. He's not the Secretary of, Defense, the Secretary of War. Sorry for.
Well, okay, so let me put it this way. I think that Pete Hegseth is smart, but he's not necessarily like a very sophisticated, like he's not Douglas McGregor. He's not a Jeffrey Sachs or Larry Wilkerson. He's the guy who's smart, but maybe not with so much depth and big context. And I think he's doing what he's told to do. He gets tasked to go and sell weapons to the Europeans, and he goes and he sells weapons to the European. And how are you going to sell them weapons? Are you going to tell them that your weapons are awesome? They're the best weapons that everybody's ever seen. And you guys can win. You can fight this war and you can beat the Russians. So just buy our weapons and then you can beat the Russians. And it doesn't matter, because really, it's not just about the weapons. You have to have people who are going to use it, who are going to be trained to use them. You need the logistics, you need the intelligence, you need the satellite information. You need so many, so they can always sell them the weapons. And then I do believe that Trump doesn't want to go to war against Russia, and he doesn't want to escalate it to the point where they would be drawn automatically because they are now a participant, like if Tomahawks start flying at Russia. So I think that they're going to stop before crossing that line. But up until that line, they're just being transactional. They're doing business. And then when they get to the line, then they're going to see how they're going to shaft the Europeans. Because, if the Europeans believe that Trump and his team are going to be loyal to them and keep their word and honor their commitments, well, then they are being naive, and I think they are actually.
Do you think that Donald Trump would care if something happens between Europe and Russia? I don't see.
In what sense? If something happens?
Yeah, well, it's something big, an attack, directly attacking each other, Europe and Russia. I don't see Donald Trump caring about that. Even put Donald Trump in a better position, in my opinion, in terms of selling more weapons, in terms of Europeans being more dominated by the United States and Trump's policies. And he knows that Russia would never attack the United States because of some reasons. And that's why if something happens between Europe and Russia, put Donald Trump in a better position. And he doesn't care about Europe. Alex, to be honest, I don't see Donald Trump caring about anything happening in Europe.
Okay, so I'm not sure that this is correct, Nima, because let's look at the precedents of two previous world wars. In both cases, the American people didn't want to go to war in Europe. I mean, in the run-up to World War I, 90% of Americans didn't want to have anything to do with it. And what happens is that the Europeans get themselves into trouble. So they push forward, they orchestrate the big war, and they even start taking some serious pain, right? And then they use this to put pressure on the Americans, like, oh, you can't just let us die here. You can't look at what the Russians are doing to us, or the Germans, or whoever. You have to come and help us. And they do have this common bond with Britain, the language, the culture, which, if things get really, really ugly, and we have to always remember that the British control the American media, the press, that the pressure to join the European war could become unbearable again. And then if that doesn't do the trick, then you can always orchestrate some kind of a sinking of the Lusitania, or a Pearl Harbor, or some other kind of a false flag event, which then is going to galvanize American public opinion, and then get the United States involved in a war, in World War III. The difference now is that the United States, First World War, Second World War, the United States was protected because it has two oceans there, right? So it's very difficult for any invading force to do any harm to them. Today, in the age of nuclear ballistic missiles, in the age of hypersonic missiles, that is no longer any kind of security. So if the United States got involved in a war against Russia, they would find themselves also in war against China, and they no longer have that, they would become a belligerent and fully exposed to the risks of Russian hypersonic missiles, or even a mutual nuclear annihilation. So in this sense, I think you can, if you cross a certain line, then you can no longer contain the damage. You can no longer predict how it's going to play out. It's easy to cross that line, but it's very difficult to then control the fallout. And so from this point of view, I think that Trump, again, we have to guess that he's aware of all this. He's giving the impression that he doesn't think that far, but I believe that he understands this, and I think that they will not cross the line, and they will not take the risk of going to war against Russia, and that they will definitely muzzle the European powers that want to trigger this war. And I have to say this: I'm only basing this on a hunch, on an idea, but I think that the American side has told the British, do not dare to stage a false flag attack. We know you're up to it. Don't do it. We know you're up to it.
The danger, Alex, with this sort of attitude, if it seems you want to fight someone, or many of these, the two people are fighting each other. Most of the time, I think more than 90%, the two people didn't know beforehand, before fighting each other. It happens. It's something. It's at the moment you decide about fighting someone. You're not planning for it. You're not going and studying how to fight. And the same happened. Even with the case of Russia, or you remember the conflict, the base of the conflict has started in 2014. Russia in 2022, when they decided to put troops on the ground in Ukraine, in eastern part of Ukraine, they didn't decide to to fight, to go and to fight Ukrainians. They wanted to show some sort of leverage in Ukraine. They wanted to force Ukraine into some sort of deal. To the last moment, Donald Putin himself said that. They haven't, they didn't know if they want to fight or they don't want to, because this is the reality of human being, Alex. That's why I think what Donald Trump is doing is, somehow this war can, the confrontation can happen without knowing that it's happening, This is the problem. I don't see this sort of, wisdom in the Trump administration to understand this escalation, selling more weapons, making fun of Europeans. After all, when we talk about Europe, you're talking about, a huge variety of people, mindset, cultural issues, historical issues. You cannot bring all of these problems all together and you say, I'm dominating them, I control them. There is no control over the behavior of these people.
You're right, Nima. But there's a very serious problem in Europe. The people who are in power are desperate to escalate the conflict against Russia to World War III scenario. And the only problem is that they are not capable of waging that war. So their idea now is to keep Ukraine fighting as long as possible while they prepare their own nations for the war, the Brits, the French, the German, the Poles, and so on. And then they're also trying to kind of leverage the Moldovans, the Romanians. They tried with Georgia. It seems that didn't work exactly, but they will continue trying. They're not going to give up. And so, I asked myself, what would I do if I were in charge, if I were negotiating these things myself? I would maybe consider forcing the Europeans to make that decision sooner before they're ready. Almost push them to the point where you say, okay, you wanted a war, now go. Here you go. Here's your opportunity. Not give them 5 years to invest all these hundreds of billions of dollars into new weapon systems and train up tens, hundreds of thousands of troops, run propaganda campaign demonizing Russia, preparing people, like Germany in the 1930s, like Ukraine after 2014, to force their hand now to say, you want war, right? You want to go to war? Well, go. We're giving you everything. We're behind you. We're not going to fight with you, but go. Because, that would bring them to a breaking point, because people like Friedrich Merz and Starmer and Emmanuel Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, they would all have to stand in front of their people and explain to them that we have to go to war against Russia. And I think that would cause all these governments to fall. So, that's a possibility. To simply force their hand, to force them to make a mistake before they are ready to negotiate the consequences. That may seem like 5D chess, and people always think like you're giving Trump too much credit. They're not thinking things through that far. But Trump is speaking with the Russians. I mean, Trump, people on his team, they are speaking with the Russians on a very regular basis and at a few levels. There's more than one delegation that are keeping regularly in contact with each other. They're keeping in touch with the Chinese. They all know where the danger is coming from. They all know who is destabilizing the world. I think that Trump wants to see the end of the European Union. I think he wants to deal with the ADF. He wants to deal with Assemblée Nationale in France. He wants to deal with Orban and Fico and these people. He doesn't want to deal with Ursula von der Leyen and with Merz and Starmer. And so increasing the heat, increasing the pressure to go into decisions that they can't really back up is the way to precipitate their decline. So I think that that's entirely possible. I wouldn't be surprised, actually. So, you know, that would then explain Pete Hegseth's otherwise inexplicable performance. You know, like if you take it at face value, you would think these people are all completely insane. They're going to plunge us into World War III. But I don't really think that this is their intention.
Alex, 2 days ago, there was an interview with the former head of national security of Iran. And in the interview, what he was revealing about the attack, the fight between the war between Iran and Israel, he said that in the final days, Iran knew that Israel is just losing. And he said that the only reason Donald Trump came in and the United States has decided to interfere was the situation with Israel. And this guy is a really serious guy. He's not talking that much. He's a military man. He's the former defense minister of Iran. And it's not that. He's not about propaganda. He made legitimate. He said, we failed here, we failed there, honestly. And I think that he was, based on the intelligence they had, he was mentioning that they knew each and every missile. Where did they hit? And, you know, he knew exactly the details of those missiles. Where, you know, he said the location they failed to, you know, to hit, the locations that they could hit. Everything, he detailed everything. But after the outcome of what he said was that Israel was losing. Do you feel, with all that said, with the new peace deal in the Middle East, many people are arguing that Israel is preparing to go ahead and to war with Iran. When I hear Iranians, when I see what is happening in the Middle East, Donald Trump talking about the Middle East, say, if Iran gets, you know, go after nuclear, we're going to hit them again. But they're not going there. And then, you know, they're far from there. Do you feel, what is your understanding of the latest events? How can we, you know, interpret the situation in the Middle East? Is the new war coming, or we can say that the war has made some sort of deterrent for Iran?
Well, it's that would be very difficult to predict, Nima, especially because pretty much everybody knows that you cannot trust the Israelis for anything. You know, they can even put their signatures on some agreement, and then if it suits them to break it tomorrow, they will break it. Now, I think that one thing that Trump has done with this peace, and I think that was probably the most complicated part of it, was that he provided a kind of insurance policy for Netanyahu. So I think that almost an hour or two after you and I last spoke, I read the news that Yair Lapid, leader of Israeli opposition, committed that he would protect Benjamin Netanyahu if there were any votes in the Knesset against him. So, you know, that takes pressure off of Benjamin Netanyahu, because the reason why he was keeping Israel at war was because he himself was finished if the war finished. his political life would end, and he would most probably end up in prison. And so, and basically he's the lord of life and death in Israel and over IDF. He's in charge, literally. And so if you remove that danger from him, then he no longer has that pressure to keep Israel constantly at war. And I think this is also the reason why Trump is now pressuring Herzog, the president of Israel, to give a pardon to Benjamin Netanyahu, because then Benjamin Netanyahu is in the clear. He no longer needs war. And, obviously, every one of us would like to see Benjamin Netanyahu in court and in prison. But if that means that 100 Palestinians have to get killed every day, then I'd rather Benjamin Netanyahu be in the clear. And so I think that the risk of Israel starting a war against Iran again has gone down a lot. I do believe that Trump also told them, you go to war against Iran, you're on your own. I mean, he's already said this, but I think this is also part of this deal. So the illusion of the illusion of the Israelis, we're going to start the war, and then the Americans will have no choice. They're going to have to come in and fight it for us. I think that fell away. I think that probably Benjamin Netanyahu's perspective has changed a lot with this peace deal, and I think that the dealing between him and Trump was, okay, you stop bombing Gaza, you stop with attacks on Iran, and I'll make sure that you're okay. And so as long as Benjamin Netanyahu is there in power, then the deal has a chance to stick. If Benjamin Netanyahu is overthrown and something bad happens to him, then who knows? I don't know. It's going to be Ben-Gvir next or Smotrich, and then you're back to square one. But I think that for the time being, let's say that the detonator has been removed from this explosive mix, and this could all change tomorrow. But I think that this peace actually it seems to me that it has a chance of being sustained.
Is the United States, Alex, with all that said, is the United States capable of making peace with Russia? Is the identity of the United States, I'm not talking about the people of the United States, there's many of politicians in the United States, I'm talking about the core, the blob, the deep state. Are they capable of making peace with Russia?
I do believe so. I think absolutely, without a doubt. And I think that this is more likely than not. But it's again a relatively complicated thing, because there's a deeply entrenched Cold War mentality in the United States that for almost 100 years, the pervasive propaganda has been always anti-Russian, and then anti-Soviet, and then anti-Russian again. And this has been practically nonstop. And so a lot of people in American academia, in the halls of power, in the security state, the Pentagon, the CIA, and so forth, are committed Cold Warriors. And so they need to be purged from the system or removed from decision-making authority. And then, I think that little by little, the climate can be created for that peace to happen. And I think that at the very highest level of the government, between Putin and Trump, between their respective delegations, I think especially between the kind of chiefs of staff, the representatives of the U.S. military and the Russian military, I think that they already cooperate. They're all aware that the war between the two sides should be unthinkable because they have the power to mutually annihilate each other. And, you know, maybe people in the city of London and on Wall Street think that that would be, a risk worth taking. But I think that for the people in the military, they understand that it's not. And you remember, we even had, under Biden administration, people from the Pentagon stopped the Biden administration from sharing intelligence, not sharing intelligence, but authorizing long-range strikes into Russia because Keir Starmer flew already to Washington with a list of targets in Russia to present to Joe Biden for him to authorize strikes against these targets. And then people from the Pentagon said, this is a really bad idea. We cannot do this. We will not do this. And then Biden, who is a committed pro-Ukrainian Cold Warrior, even he had to say, sorry, we can't proceed on this. I think that under Trump, this is probably even a lot stronger. We know that Trump administration has done a few very significant steps, like they have stopped sharing intelligence on their contacts with the Russians, with the British, with the Canadians, with the Australians, and with New Zealand, with the other 4 of the Five Eyes. They've also removed security clearances from, was it 27 or 37 of former high-level people in the Pentagon and the CIA and so forth. So I think that this purge of the Cold Warrior types from decision-making circuitry is gradually happening, but it'll take maybe a little bit of time. But I think that peace can be had. It will be had so long as Trump and Putin are alive, and you never know. If Putin drops dead tomorrow, who knows what happens? If Trump drops dead tomorrow, who knows? But I think that while the two of them are alive, I think it's more likely than not that we will have peace between Russia and the United States. And then, that's not such a shocking thing because Russia and the United States are natural allies, and they have been allies throughout throughout the whole of the 19th century, and practically since the United States became a nation, they have been on very friendly terms. They had a very close friendship and an alliance for a very long time. Not necessarily because Americans and Russians love each other that much, but because they have really natural common interests. And these interests didn't disappear because everybody has been propagandized to ignore them. They're still there.
Yeah. Here is what FSB Director Alexander Bortnikov, and he said that Russia has information about sabotage preparations against the Turkish Stream gas pipeline by British and Ukrainian special services. Do they really do? If they do that, how is that going to influence the behavior of the Turkish government? Are they going to react, in your opinion, from what we've seen so far from Erdogan and his administration? Or they feel, they're going to behave like the German government, or they can be compromised, they can be managed?
My guess would be that they will react like the Germans, at least Erdogan and his government, because they are very much in cahoots with British intelligence, and so if and they are covertly supportive of Ukraine, because part of the Turkish political class is very nervous about having a very, very powerful Russia dominating the Black Sea. So, while they don't want to go to war against Russia, they would like to play off Russia and Ukraine so that they keep each other weak and busy between each other. But what you can't predict is how the Turkish people might react to this, because Turkish people have been seeing all this happen, and they have been seeing Erdogan, fulminate against Israel and then do exactly nothing at all. And you can't predict that could be the drop that overflows the glass, and then maybe Erdogan ends up thrown out of office and somebody else takes power who might be more radical, less compromised. It's hard to say, but as far as Erdogan is concerned, I think he would try to pretend like nothing happened, like the Germans. Turkish people, a different story, but not necessarily predictable.
Yeah. Alex, the case of Venezuela is coming to there was an article in New York Times yesterday said that Trump administration authorized covert CIA action in Venezuela to overthrow Maduro in Venezuela. What is this obsession with Venezuela? Bombing the boats. Nobody knows, these are civilians, because we have Colombians coming out. These were Colombian, people. And the other day we had the people, other countries. I cannot remember. Burkina Faso. No, it wasn't Burkina Faso. It was the Trinidad and Tobago. And they came out and said that the United States killed some of their people because of these actions. What is the obsession with Venezuela? Is that all about oil? Is that all about, the mindset of putting more pressure on Russia, controlling the oil industry, the market of oil?
No. It's not all about oil. There's also gold. There's other resources, but it's definitely to do with Venezuela's resources. Oil primarily, but there's more than that. I think that first of all, we have to understand where the pressure is coming from. Where is the pressure to overthrow Maduro government coming from? And it's not from Trump administration, and it's not exclusively from the United States. It's coming from Wall Street, but it's coming also from other banking centers, primarily the City of London. And okay, so in 2003, I think, early 2000s, Aaron Russo, he was a filmmaker. He gave an interview in which he said something very interesting and indicative, and so he became friends with Neil Rockefeller, one of the scions of the Rockefeller family, and they became personal friends. And he said in this interview how Neil Rockefeller told him that there was going to be an event, and he was talking about 9/11 terrorist attacks. And their conversation was before 9/11. But Neil Rockefeller knew that 9/11 was going to happen. And then he said, and then on the back of that event, we're going to declare war on terror. And that's really cool because there isn't really a real enemy. So you can go intervene wherever and then anywhere and everywhere because, you just have to say there's terrorists there and you go to war. So we're going to go to Afghanistan and Iraq. But he also said, we're going to go to Venezuela. Okay. So the plans to take over Venezuela are not new. They're, at least 20 years old and older. And then, in 2003, there was an attempt to overthrow Hugo Chavez, but that coup failed and Hugo Chavez remained in power. He was rescued by his own people and his military. And then there was another coup attempt in 2019 under Trump. And in this case, they, Juan Guaido declared himself president, and everybody, in Europe, in London, Donald Trump, everybody said, "Oh yeah, Juan Guaido is the legitimate president." But then nothing happened. It all kind of got forgotten, and then Maduro is still in power since then. And another way we know that the pressure is coming from a higher level than the U.S. government is because the leader of Venezuelan opposition just won the Nobel Peace Prize, Maria Machado, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maria Machado is about the last person on this planet who deserves a Nobel Peace Prize, but she got it because there's a plan at some very high level to overthrow the Venezuelan government and to instill her. Trump wanted the Peace Prize for himself, but this tells you that it's not Trump's decision, it's somebody else's decision. And now, you have U.S. troops provoking Venezuela into retaliating, which then would probably give the American side a justification to intervene. But I have to ask myself, what can you achieve with 8 frigates and destroyers and 6,000 troops? You can launch some missiles, you can blow up a few things, but you can't take control of the country. I'm not certain. Let's say that the Venezuelan situation will give us maybe the most important indication of Trump, of who he is and where his loyalties lie. Because, as I said, I think it's pretty clear that the pressure to overthrow Venezuelan government comes from the banking cartel. And if Trump allows himself to deploy American military, American troops, put them at risk, to hand a victory to the banking cartel, to the global banking cartel, then Trump has betrayed his voters, he's betrayed everybody. If, on the other hand, he does like in 2019, does a lot of noise, a lot of these blows up boats, has CIA people running, I don't know what, in Venezuela, and then achieves nothing, in that case, maybe he's doing the right thing. That is, like in 2019, he made all the right noises. He said like, "Oh, I recognize Juan Guaido and, Venezuela, this and that," it all sounded very real, except that then he turned the whole assignment to John Bolton and Elliot Abrams, 2 of the biggest losers in the American political class that you could possibly find. So obviously they failed at this, and there was no regime change. Now, in the end, I have to explain why the bankers want a new government in Venezuela, because Venezuela has an estimated 300 billion barrels of crude oil, or maybe a little bit more than that. They have an estimated 185 tons of gold reserves. And all this, all these resources, you could buy them. You don't have to go to war to take them. You can buy them. And the United States is by far the biggest market in the hemisphere. And so the Americans could go to Venezuela and negotiate very favorable long-term contracts to make sure that all that wealth, all those resources flow to the American markets, to the mutual benefit of both the United States and Venezuela, paid for in US dollars, so that those dollars are recycled in the Federal Reserve in the United States, go to US treasuries and so forth. So it could be very good for both sides. But the banking cartel gets nothing, or, very close to nothing. The banking cartel wins a big win if they get control over all that resource wealth and they turned it into their own collateral, because then they can issue loans to their clients, like BP, like Exxon, like Royal Dutch Shell, and so forth. And those loans then become profitable assets on their balance sheets. And they can issue those loans because they would be secured with Venezuelan resources, Venezuelan oil or gold or whatever. And even the Venezuelan government could become the client of JP Morgan and Citigroup and so forth. And again, those loans to the Venezuelan government would be secured by Venezuelan resources. How much money is that? Just to give you a perspective, because back in April, I wrote an article detailing all this with respect to Alberta's crude oil reserves, so Canada. Alberta has an estimated 175 billion barrels in proven oil reserves. In the early 2000s, or even in the late 1990s, the Rockefeller interests in New York were able to take control of that collateral. That turned it into $9 trillion worth of assets for the banking system. And most of that was used to create a new credit cycle. And the bulk of that went into mortgage, it blew up the credit bubble, the mortgages bubble, right? It was a $5 trillion bubble, which then burst in 2007, 2008. And then the banks turned around, and when the bubble burst, they went to the state to ask for a bailout. And according to the Government Accounting Office, they received at the very minimum $16 trillion in bailouts. And it wasn't just American banks. You know, this is the thing. It's not just American banks. The bailout went to Japanese banks, to French banks, to German banks, to Swiss banks. It was basically a massive looting operation, but that looting operation needed fresh money, good collateral in the system. Anyway, $16 trillion, just to give people perspective, because, you know, trillion, quadrillion, you know, people get lost in these zeros. Basically what it is at the very least $42,000 per every man, woman, and child living in the United States. That is far, far more than the big oil, than even the military industrial complex. Everything else, it eclipses everything else. It's the biggest prize if you take some country's collateral under your control. It's absolutely gargantuan. And so, you know, if 175 billion barrels of Canadian oil could be turned into $9 trillion of collateral into a $16+ trillion bailout, then imagine what you could do with 300 billion barrels of Venezuelan oil. You could do that same thing, only a lot bigger still. And basically, why am I pointing finger to the banks? Because they are the only group in society who have that incentive. No other group has that incentive. So they have the incentive, the means, and the opportunity. And this is where the pressure on Venezuela is coming from. And so if Trump hands them Venezuela, then he has betrayed everything that he claims to stand for. So to me, that's the one to watch. You know, things going on in the Middle East, I think I see a possibility of Trump playing a positive role. Ukraine, Russia, positive role. Venezuela is the one that worries me a lot, because I'm not sure that he's on our side there. But you know, we will know if the regime change operation fails. If it succeeds and the Nobel laureate Machado becomes the new president of Venezuela, then he handed a massive win to the bankers.
Yeah. I believe that Venezuela is so much important, and I don't know what is the policy of Russia, China, and Iran, but I really want them to support Venezuela.
Yeah, it's there's a lot we don't know. It's very complicated. Venezuela has been under very, very tough sanctions by the Trump regime, and they practically broke diplomatic relations. And then when the war started in Ukraine, then the Biden sent a delegation to Venezuela, and they had very extensive negotiations, and they came to agreements that are not fully disclosed to the public. So ostensibly, it was about sending oil to the United States. So they kind of lifted sanctions to make it possible for Venezuela to sell their oil to the United States. Okay, that seems legit and fair, but there were other parts of the agreements that were not disclosed, and I suspect that part of it was because one part of the Biden administration agenda was to draw all these illegal immigrants into the United States. And it seems to me that they went to the Maduro government and said, like, could you maybe send us your, empty out your prison and send these people our way, send them to the United States. And that the Maduro government said, like, all right, fine, that's what you want, that's what you get. And that they actually then really emptied out their prisons, and all these drug gangs and were really sent over to the United States. So that adds another dimension where the Trump administration has a huge problem with the Maduro government. But then Maduro government, they sent secretly a delegation to talk to Trump people, and they said, like, hey, look, we stop all this. We're going to sell all the oil to you. We're going to give you preferential treatment. We're going to stop sending oil to China. We're going to cut our ties with Venezuela and with China. And you can have absolute priority in developing all of Venezuela's resources. Apparently, the answer was no. Apparently, they told them, no deal. We're driving for regime change. So the situation is a bit more complicated than we know, but we know that it is complicated. And what's going to happen, I'm not sure. But again, it's Wall Street and the City of London that's in the driver's seat here. And if Trump makes himself their minion, then that's going to be a profound disappointment.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alex, for being with us today.
Always a pleasure, Nima. Take care.
Good for you. Follow me.